I'm about to do something that no one else has ever done. If this is your first time on the channel, hello, my name's Angus, and I've spent the past year of my life researching and reading and writing, and I wrote down several adjectives here. Everything involving the Port Arthur Massacre. There are a few reasons for this, the primary reason being that I became obsessed with the Port Arthur truth community. At least that's what I call them. They're people who believe that the Port Arthur Massacre was a false flag attack perpetrated by the government. And if you have already watched my earlier videos, I've made it pretty abundantly clear that I do not believe in any of these theories, and I think they are utter bullshit. This community represents so much about evangelical right-wing Australia. This tiny cul-de-sac of a conspiracy theory have taught me a lot. Well, rather, they have prompted me to teach myself a lot about Australian history and the psychology of conspiracy theories. I've done all of this because I genuinely believe that Port Arthur truth is one of the worst conspiracy theories in the entire world. The nature of pat evidence ranges from relatively decent questions to completely wild accusations. I am, in good faith, going to discuss why I disagree with all of them. Now, I'm not going to talk about rumours or completely unsubstantiated claims. The best example of this is what I refer to as the fireworks argument. When he was a young boy, Blondie was burned by some fireworks, and he was interviewed in hospital about it. Now, some fringe Port Arthur truthers claim that this is how Blondie was initially selected for this process. He appears dumb and able to make dumb decisions. And I feel like most people would chalk this up to just being silly. This example lies Thank you, drug boy. This example lies far beyond the demarcation line. They have no basis in reality, and it is pure speculation. Along with this, I will not entertain local rumours or urban legends, theories about this or that local actually secretly being behind the massacre. Claims like this do not contain any kind of threshold of evidence, and as a debunker, I need evidence to work with. Consequently, Port Arthur truth is also pretty light on for that. You must remember that the burden of proof lies upon the theorist. They have to prove something before they say it. I want to reiterate that I am the first person making a large resource for the purpose of debunking this particular movement. While that is very exciting, at least to me, it means inevitably that I'm going to miss a couple of small claims. I aim to admit where precisely I do not have enough evidence to support my claims, and I will not make a claim which I do not believe to be true. One of the target audiences of this video will undoubtedly be the conspiracy theorists. There is already a chance that just by making this video, they will be quite cross with me. So I want to say that while I might come across as a little bit irreverent sometimes, I hope that you see that I treat you with respect. In my previous video, I demonstrated how you, the community, have been lied to by platforms and grifters for money. I think that all members of Port Arthur Truth see themselves as intelligent people. I hope that they appreciate the fact that I am using my freedom of speech to illuminate some facts that they may not have heard before. You know, when I criticize this community, I do not specifically mean individual members. I am mainly talking about content creators and admins. There might be some people out there who claim that I am being a little bit manipulative by using certain strategies. I initially got this idea from professional debunker extraordinaire Nick West. In his book Escaping the Rabbit Hole, he talks about how there are different types of debunking. Spotlight debunking is generally small scale. This is when you debunk a specific point. Say that your favorite piece of evidence in 9/11 truth is the infamous thought-terminating cliche, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. To debunk this claim, you only have to point out that the temperature of burning jet fuel is enough to weaken a structure to the point of its losing its strength and collapsing in on itself. This is getting the attention of one problem and solving that one problem. This point can cause the theorist to begin to self-reflect. If their favorite piece of evidence has been shown to be bunk, they might well start seeing holes everywhere in their theory. In contrast, floodlight debunking is not about debunking specific issues, but uprooting someone's entire worldview. You know, simply pointing out that the Earth is in fact round is not going to cause a flat earther to say, oh geez, I was wrong. This is because flat Earth is a symptom of their view of the world. You essentially have to prove that science is a good thing to them. So my method here is to illuminate a floodlight's worth of spotlights. I plan to debunk every single point I can think of, thus I will hopefully uplift their worldview and give them pause for reflection. My goal is genuinely to educate people. I do not do this because I have been paid by anyone. I simply think the topic is interesting, and I just want to throw myself out there into the discourse. Finally, I must state once again that this is my opinion. My word is not gospel, but I'm not only presenting my own words. I present the word of experts, survivors, and some of my own opinions. My research has taken me to some interesting places, and I have spoken to some people that no one else in this community has spoken to. Now, with nearly 5 hours of preamble and context, we can finally get into this. I wish to return to what I call the Port Arthur Truth Pentagon. This is a generalization of the movement, and they are generally 5 different clusters of issues. So what I've done is I've created 5 different chapters that all focus upon one main issue. The first chapter will focus on psychology. Blondie did not have the psychological capacity to actually pull off the massacre. 2. Blondie is innocent because another gunman was in the Port Arthur cafe, and/or he was mind controlled. 3. The state of Tasmania owned a large mortuary truck. 4. The door to the Port Arthur Cafe gift shop was locked by the management, so more people would die. And 5. Everyone in the Port Arthur Cafe was shot in the head from the hip, indicating a far more skilled gunman than the official narrative. With that out of the way, Hey there! I bought a new microphone because I wanted to make sure everyone knew that I was taking this seriously. So, oh god, I'm about to holistically debunk an entire conspiracy theory. Hashtag content. What have I got? One of the first things that truthers will tell you about is how odd it is that someone of Blondie's mental capacity could have planned this spree shooting. Now, I've spoken at length up to this point about the consequences of Blondie's actions, but we've not actually talked about his personality. By all accounts, Blondie was a resentful, spiteful, socially inept reject who craved attention. After the death of Miss Harvey, he grew resentful and frustrated at everyone who refused to talk to him. The influence of these 2 departed persons kept him in check. He had a wicked narcissism complex, and he saw himself as much more important than he really was. Now, many people struggle to make friends. I know I do, but they don't go out and kill people over it. But I think that even the truthers will agree that Blondie was a bit mad. The flared suits, the violent outbursts, the many more strange behaviours that put him firmly outside of people's comfort zones.
So, was he crazy?
No.
Mad?
No. I mean, he's mad in the everyday sense of the word. He did something that none of us can, almost none of us can even get our heads around imagining, let alone doing. But no, he did not have a serious mental illness. He did not have schizophrenia.
We can look at him now and see that he was a bad egg. I think that people who see themselves as rational and logical can't begin to comprehend why someone would do such an awful spree shooting. According to Wainwright and Totoro, he was deemed sane by the state, but he had diminished mental capacity. Now, this does not mean that he was completely incapable of looking after himself. He travelled all around the world, for heaven's sake. However, just because you are sane does not inherently mean you are rational. The first thing you learn about in philosophy classes, apart from how glorious the Greeks apparently were, is what are the properties of a good argument. Now, for an argument to be solid or sound, it firstly needs to be valid in that the premises make logical, sequential, and referential sense, and secondly, the premises need to be true, based in reality and fact. So the 2 are not mutually exclusive. An argument can be logically valid but not true, and vice versa. Logic is an artificial construct. People are not inherently rational actors, and we can see this in the case of Blondie, a person of limited mental capacity who struggles with social relationships. Now, I've always liked what Michel Foucault says about the logic of madness.
We must note that in themselves they are neither absurd nor illogical. On the contrary, they apply correctly the most rigorous figures of logic. Induction extended to infinity in a man suffering from persecution delusions. A, B, C are my enemies. All of them are men, therefore all men are my enemies.
From this example, we can observe that the first premise might be true, and that leads to a logical induction. But the final deduction is illogical. We can see how someone who is not in a good mental health state could come to this conclusion. It is impossible to rationally explain why a spree shooting happens because they occur almost completely irrationally.
This fellow had gone and killed a large number of people. He had attempted to encourage police to become involved.
And you thought, at the time, he's just playing a game with me?
Yeah, it was just it was a game. It was a game where he really didn't have any exit strategy.
That does not mean, however, that we cannot point out individual factors that contribute to these horrible events.
Bryant was a good-looking young man. Blonde, blue-eyed, handsome, childlike. And one of the problems I think throughout Bryant's life was that he looked an attractive kid, an attractive adolescent, an attractive adult. He also looked an intelligent kid, an intelligent adolescent, an intelligent adult, but he wasn't. So people who met him had an expectation of what he would be able to say and do and how he'd react, which he couldn't live up to. When we are rejected by another person, we may feel sad for an hour or two, but we eventually get over it. Blondie was a man who was so used to being rejected that it reinforced a certain type of worldview, in which he had been unjustly persecuted by people not liking his bizarre nature. This person was rude to me, many others were also rude to me, therefore everyone is rude. Therefore, I should take vengeance. Now along with this, we must also take into consideration the psychology of the spree shooter. So according to Dr. Paul Mullen, Blondie's forensic psychiatrist, who studied 8 cases of spree shootings in New Zealand and Australia, including the shootings of Strathfield, Queen Street and Hoddle Street,
all these men were socially inept, utterly self-absorbed and ultimately highly resentful. Each one exhibited a slow build-up of festering anger underpinned by an overblown and overwhelming sense of victimhood about the way the other people treated them.
And perhaps one of the most interesting things about these killings, where an individual goes into a public place and kills people until they themselves are killed or until they're captured, only started happening in Western society relatively recently. And this seemed to create a cultural script for angry, disaffected, desperate young men who were thinking of suicide to kill themselves in what they saw as a blaze of glory.
There is plenty of modern research on the psychology of school shooters. Now, truthers will agree with me that Blondie has a much younger mental age than his physical age of then 28.
He's very childlike in his personality. He's got the mind of about a 9-year-old.
Therefore, I reason that comparing and contrasting with school shooters is not terribly unreasonable.
You're talking about men between 20 and 40. They are almost all social isolates. Interestingly, they are almost all rather obsessional, rigid individuals, and they plan these things very carefully. They are almost always people who have an excessive interest in things military, police, survivalist, fascination with guns. Many of them have extreme right-wing views, which fits into this whole them as major, glorious authority figures.
In cases such as this, they tend to be suicidal. In Born or Bred, Wainwright and Totoro note that Blondie was suicidal in the year prior to the Port Arthur Massacre. They tend not to be able to manage their anger. There are several stories from Blondie's neighbours about screaming matches he had with people over minor differences.
Up until recently, he used to live in this little farm cottage on 75 acres of land. He's now in police custody, but the locals around here say that's not surprising. You see, in a strange twist, almost 5 years ago, was reported to police for threatening to shoot 3 people, including a small child. Incredibly, the police did nothing.
You would have thought they would have checked it up, but a lot of things are swept under the carpet, I think. When I first met him, we had a bit of an altercation and he followed me home and then he threatened he'd shoot me.
In Part 1, Chapter 3, we discussed the fact that Blondie's wealth was placed under a trust fund. In the 6 months before Port Arthur, the trustee said that he was no longer allowed to freely travel the world, as she saw this as a waste of money. Most importantly, they want to be remembered as evil people. I use the word evil as it is a construction, an exaggeration on human nature. They don't want to be bad, they want to be seen as bad.
So there's a constant theme here of Bryant wanting notoriety.
Notoriety and ringmaster in the circus. He wanted to be the fellow who'd committed the worst crime in Australia's history.
By doing this one horrifically bad thing in their life, they can fulfill that desire. A majority of Port Arthur Truth claim that Blondie, a man with the intelligence of a child, could not have pulled off something of this scale. So they argue that his intelligence made him clumsy and unable to think straight. This argument is purely speculative. They constantly point to the fact that Blondie was given an IQ of 66, placing him in the bottom 2 percentile of Australians. This is their evidence that he was completely incapable of making even simple plans. Firstly, psychologists and people who knew him alike assert that Blondie had the social capacity to function within society. He could get himself around, he could look after himself, especially with his inherited wealth. He was not completely incapable of functioning in a modern society. A psychiatrist even noted that even though Blondie was undeniably intellectually challenged, he could still function independently. I think that this low IQ argument has an element of ableism to it, and I'm not trying to defend Blondie here, far from it. Much of my thinking on ASD, specifically Asperger's, comes from historian Edith Schaeffer's magnificent book, Asperger's Children: The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna. She discusses how much of our understanding of ASD comes from Nazis, who saw autism as this kind of othering trait.
The autism spectrum exaggerates the range of a child's possible places in society. On one end, a youth with autism might face a lifetime of severe disability and isolation, and on the other, adapt and be perceived to have superior abilities. With the prevalence of technology in our daily lives, autism preys upon fears of detachment and inability to adjust, as well as dreams of skills coveted in these new times, of savant engineers, scientists, and coders. We project a bifurcated two-dimensional spectrum, maintaining Asperger's distinction between those who might be assimilated and those who might not. A diagnosis of autism suggests problems, whereas Asperger's disorder or high-functioning autism suggests those who might be incorporated and be productive, even superior. The conception of an ever-broadening spectrum taps into our greatest hopes and fears for our children, and for society.
When we construct people in terms of their importance, it is determined by their ability to function in a team. Any person who struggles in this form of interaction is seen as lesser by the people in charge. To the authoritarian state, they are deemed to have less social value because they do not traditionally fit in as another cog in the machine. The infantilization of autistic people not only robs the autistic person of their agency, but it also robs them of their accountability. And autism might explain some behaviors, but it does not justify them in any way. Just because Blondie has Asperger's does not mean he is not capable of being responsible of his own actions. This notion robs the man in prison of his agency, and that man decided of his own accord to kill as many people as he could in Port Arthur. Secondly, for this IQ-based argument to work, you have to believe that IQ is a good way of measuring intelligence. Mercifully for you, I don't have time to debunk IQ. As much as I would love to, I would have to write another entire series about the topic. But in philosophy, we are taught to assume the best possible interpretation of an argument, then reject the premise outright. And although I quite strongly and passionately believe that the multiple intelligence theory is a vastly more rounded and valid way of measuring intelligence, as an act of good faith, I will argue with the IQ point in mind. So after much consideration, even with an IQ of 66, the Port Arthur Massacre, to put it quite bluntly, was not a particularly complex plan. You get a gun, or three, walk into a cafe, walk table to table shooting people where they sit, and that doesn't require much forethought. The same goes for stalking the grounds, terrorizing motorists, and retreating back to Seascape. Now before I get to that point, I would like to discuss that prior to committing the massacre, Blondie loved to travel internationally. With his trust fund assets, he traveled the world! America, Japan, Europe, Southeast Asia. Even if he didn't always stay for the entire planned trip, he still managed to function independently and often create elaborate plans. This proves his capacity to exist independently while traveling for differently nuanced social circumstances. As the evidence suggests in Part 1, Chapter 3, he planned the massacre out for at least 4 weeks ahead of time. In fact, when he missed the ferry to the Isle of the Dead, he changed his plans. As you might remember, this is evidenced by a pair of witnesses who met Blondie on the way to Port Arthur on the 26th of April 1996. So according to Altman, after helping a couple of young women in a broken down car, the witness asked him where he was going. Blondie remarked to him that,
"I'm going to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps."
Afterwards, he said meet me in the Port Arthur cafe and shout me a coffee. So he clearly had a plan B in case he missed a ferry. This means that either A, he initiated his plan B, which was to slaughter the occupants of the Port Arthur cafe when he missed the boat, or B, he missed it and then improvised a new plan, thus making him capable of coming up with new plans as he went along. Considering all of this, I have no doubt in my mind that Blondie, even under all of these circumstances, could have done the massacre. Port Arthur Truth has to infantilize Blondie, because if he was an autonomous agent, he would be able to do things by himself. And thus, he would be capable of doing this. But their narrative requires a baby who is not able to look after himself. The argument that he wasn't intelligent enough is baseless. But we will never know why any of this happened. But it does make sense to him. As Foucault observes,
"The marvelous logic of the man, which seemed to mock that of the logicians, because it resembles it so exactly."
Port Arthur Truthers claim that eyewitnesses recognized Blondie at a beach 10 kilometers away from the historic site while the massacre was going on. Now, in my research, I have never seen the eyewitness named once. Gee whiz, that's funny. They call her Jane or something like that. We'd have no actual evidence. So this, along with other various identifications around the state, they claim that these eyewitnesses were ignored by police and the prosecution, thus proving that Blondie had a scheme put up against him. This is a common trend for Pats. They will claim that there are plenty of people claiming to the contrary without being able to name a single one. What they don't seem to consider is the hundreds of people who gave positive identifications, including survivors and eyewitnesses and staff on site. Hundreds of random people were not secret government agents. Now, I must note that those who claim to see him elsewhere are not entirely to blame. They are not doing a crime or necessarily a lie. The psychology of memory was complex enough before you added trauma to the mix. Memory is made up of 3 different processes. Encoding, which is the initial act of storing information, storage, which pertains to the maintenance of information, and recall, the act of bringing stored information back for any use a person needs. The maintenance of storage takes a long time. Depending on the length of time and the type of encoding, the memory will last longer. There are different types of encoding, but what is important for us is that when a person is in danger, their memory can be affected. Right after a traumatic event, when we still have traces of adrenaline in our systems, this is when our memory is freshest. The victim has a lot of information, but they haven't had time to store it correctly. This can lead to memories eroding over time. In some circumstances, we can dissociate to escape the situation, but no one involved in the Port Arthur Massacre ever reported such a thing happening. The brain may say this is hurtful and this causes me pain, so I will repress it. But this does not happen right away. The victims and eyewitnesses were interviewed mere hours after this event. This, coupled with the hundreds of other people saying that they saw this man at this place, means it's sound evidence. By the end of the first day, police had conducted interviews with 600 witnesses on site. Now, those who claim they saw Blondie elsewhere were terribly shocked by the event. Everyone in Australia was. So, I'm going to give you a quick analogy. Say you are robbed by a young man who is clean shaven, but it happens so quickly that you're not entirely able to confirm what he looks like. You call the police and you give a vague description of what the man looked like from your memory. The next day, the police say they have found the man who fits your vague description, but he has a mustache. Police officers have to be very careful when they ask witnesses for positive identifications, because they do not want to make people make false identifications. They will ask, is this the man who robbed you? Because this triggers your recall function. They are asking you, is this the person you remember? If you were to state, this is the man who robbed you, this will trigger your encoding function. This is because this question changes your memory. Several psychological studies have given evidence saying that when this happens, our brains will encode new information onto our recalled memories. In this situation, you can now, all of a sudden, recall the man having a mustache, and you believe you were initially mistaken. Now this is a flaw in the human brain that psychologists have been aware of for a long time. This is why we ask victims what happens instead of telling them what happened. It should be noted that authority figures also affect this function. You assume that they know what they're doing more than you might. Whether a police officer or major newspaper, authority affects your recall function. In a legal investigation, the person asking you questions must avoid asking leading questions where possible. That being, questions that lead the witness towards a particular answer. During a criminal law case, this is necessary so as to not influence the memory or testimony of someone who may be giving evidence. So this is generally why newspapers normally blank out someone accused of the crime's face, so that the weird blonde dude that you saw at the beach comes back into your mind, and you put Blondie's face onto their face because you associate the time of day with the weird one with Blondie. This is the man on the front page in bold text! Murdoch, what the fuck? I mean, is anyone actually surprised that a few random people thought they saw the most infamous face in Tasmania in 1996 in the aftermath? Any weird-looking blonde-haired dude could have been mistaken. So even if a few people misidentified Blondie, that does not outweigh the hundreds of positive identifications from the survivors who were actually on site.
I mean, the board kind of says it all.
In 1996, on April 28th,
the state of Tasmania had just over 1,000 police officers. There were only 2 officers in the peninsula area on the morning of the Port Arthur Massacre. This was an otherwise quiet Sunday, where the police were scattered. Conspiracy theorists allege that the reason that there were no police on site during the shooting was that they would be called away on some wild goose chase. They point to the fact that on the morning of the Port Arthur Massacre, the only officers on the peninsula were called far away for some nebulous drug bust somewhere in the bush. So that is true, but it wasn't a drug bust. Someone dropped a bag of laundry powder on the side of the road. Someone called it in and the police checked on it. This is going to be the start of a theme. The existence of a coincidence does not presuppose that a conspiracy exists. Those 2 police officers could have been anywhere on the peninsula, and conspiracy theorists would still cry foul play. Some conspiracy theorists also say that Blondie was the one who made this phone call, which is a big brain a take, I'll give them that. There's no evidence to back this up, no phone records, nothing. You can't just say something and automatically believe it. You have to have evidence to justify your beliefs in a conspiracy theory. I would be willing to agree that the placement of police would be significant if they both happened to be on site. But they weren't, and this is an otherwise unremarkable Sunday. Nobody was expecting the massacre to happen. Conspiracy theorists allege that police ignored those on site. Just because they felt like it, I guess? As I explained in part 1 of this series, this was a tactical decision to capture the mass shooter and stop him from causing further harm to civilians. This was not a decision without consequences. Conspiracy theorists especially take issue with the shooting taking place at 1:25 and police not arriving on site until about 5 PM. According to their calculations, it only takes an hour and a half to get from Hobart to Port Arthur, and presumably they should have arrived on site sooner. As I discussed at length in Part 1, Chapter 3, this decision was made on-site by Ian Kingston. The priority was getting all of the police officers to focus on the capture of the spree shooter. This also ignores the fact that about 500 police officers were called in, half of the state's force. This takes time to gather up this many people. It further takes a lot of time to establish the SOG, the negotiators, and other specialists. Many of them were off shift on the day, and they needed to gather their gear. They also needed to organize their formation. They couldn't simply arrive one by one on site. It takes multiple hours to complete an emergency plan. Now, all of this is not to say that I do not somewhat agree that there should have been more police on site sooner. It would have given survivors better peace of mind if there were people on site to protect them. We know that Ian Kingston was in charge, and he asked police to ensure that they captured the killer. but that information was not spread around everyone on site, and it does not follow that there was this specific conspiracy to keep officers away from Port Arthur. The premise of this specific theory is that survivors were left alone on site for some negligent reason, but this does not account for everything that I have covered here. There are reasons why officers didn't arrive sooner. This argument will come across as false the second I say it because I've already explained what happened earlier in this miniseries. There exists audio of a phone call between the negotiator Terry McCarthy and Blondie.
Oh, hello.
It's Terry again. How are you?
I'm fine.
How's things going in there, mate?
Fine, couldn't be better. Just like on a Hawaiian holiday.
Hawaiian holiday?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean by that.
I don't know myself, no.
Jamie.
Yes, hello. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Jamie. Yourself?
Well, I'm well up till now, the past few 20 seconds.
Conspiracy theorists have multiple problems with this. First, they wonder who Jamie was. It's an alias. It was an alias. He felt like making up an alias. No one knows exactly why he decided to goddamn call himself Jamie. But, you know, no one really understands why he decided to harass women either. So, you know, there are bigger problems here than trying to figure out who the fuck Jamie was. Jamie was non-existent. Secondly, conspiracy theorists believe that someone would not be able to shoot from multiple rooms while on a landline phone. They are willfully ignorant of the fact that Blondie was speaking to the officers on a wireless phone. So this theory implies that there were multiple gunmen inside of Seascape. Negotiators and police established that Blondie did in fact have a wireless phone.
Our principle at the moment is to keep the house isolated and the people in it contained within the site, and we're hoping to open negotiations again. They've broken down because of some technical problems. A battery, I understand, and a phone that he had in the house ran out.
Has power to the
house. It's as simple as that.
Since Seascape burned down, we do not have the exact phone that he used, as it was presumably melted in the blaze. However, we also know that Blondie lost contact with police at approximately 9 PM. The sudden loss of contact is neatly explained by the wireless phone argument. With the continued contact throughout the night, the battery would not be able to last. We know the police wanted to drive a bulldozer up to Seascape to give Blondie a new phone battery. This plan, however, was scrapped by morning. Conspiracy theorists might well say, you're getting all of this information from the police. They have an interest in maintaining the narrative. Therefore, they're not trustworthy. I have two main points to this. Firstly, the burden of proof lies on you, the theorist. There has been no substantial pieces of evidence even suggesting that there was a landline. You need to bring something forward before we can trust you. Secondly, for the police to lie on such an insignificant matter as the kind of phone Blondie was using, this would have caused the event to be uncovered years ago. It is hard to keep a conspiracy a secret. On trivial matters such as these, it is easy to prove the state wrong, so simply ask to see the evidence to the contrary. If you cannot produce evidence, I cannot believe it was just a landline. This leads us to our next point. Let's listen back to this audio really quickly.
I'm making up some sandwiches. These people...
So that noise that you heard, it was a gunshot, right? Well, according to the police report, this was a cough. There was something like 26 coughs recorded on this phone. So, this is the single individual point where I think Port Arthur truthers are correct. This is simply a mistake on the part of the police, right? As we know, Blondie could walk around different rooms shooting people while he was on the phone. Theorists believe that by calling this gunshot a cough, the state is covering up the existence of multiple shooters inside of Seascape. He had the ability to move and shoot while he was in conversation. This mistake in the transcription is proof to a theorist that they are trying to cover their tracks. In reality, such a sudden, stressful, and panicked situation means that not every part of the state's response is going to be executed perfectly. Yes, this was a mistake, but it does not infer that a conspiracy exists. This is merely trivial. It does not prove anything. So let's examine very quickly the previous audio clip once again.
I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got salad and some bacon in them.
Right.
And eggs. I'm going to fry up some bacon and eggs for them.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I've got to go because this kettle's squealing downstairs, and I'm making a cup of tea now for the hostages.
We understand that this phone call took place in the evening. Therefore, the hostages must have still been alive at this point, right? Well, in episode 1, chapter 3, I discussed at length the evidence that the Martins were being murdered by this point. Thus, the prefix of plural hostages cannot exist because there was not any more than one hostage. This is a bluff designed to confuse police. There is minor evidence to suggest that Mr. Pears was alive at this point, but the forensic evidence concluded that he was murdered shortly after being taken inside. We also know that there was only one shooter inside of the house, and that was Blondie. Therefore, as Blondie was speaking on the phone in the kitchen, this is further evidence to suggest that he was using a wireless phone. He wasn't in the kitchen before!
Very tangentially, theorists try to use Blondie's false admission that he was making food for his hostages as character evidence. Not only are the hostages still alive, Blondie is nice and honest, and he couldn't have been the one to kill them. I would like to explore why he would be motivated to lie instead. For one, he was under siege. If he created a pretense where he could still murder innocent people, he would hold power over police. They might conform to his delusional demands. We already know that the officers did not storm Seascape out of fear that they might kill more hostages. Blondie wanted to escape Seascape, and in that moment, he thought that he might be able to get a helicopter to come to him if he claimed that all of his hostages were still alive.
The story makes more sense if we believe that Blondie was lying to try and escape. After 9 PM, the police lost contact with Blondie. This is because the battery on his wireless phone died, remember? See, I trust you and your intelligence. You can remember things good. Negotiators tried to figure out a way to re-establish contact with Blondie, but they never spoke to him on the phone again. At this point, it was pitch black dark, and Blondie was still firing at police officers. Conspiracy theorists allege that there must have been special equipment to shoot police in the dark. You're not gonna believe this, but this is very easily debunked.
The sporadic shooting from Blondie during the night was somehow targeting the Special Operations Group officers hiding in the bush and surrounding the cottages, and he was putting bullets very close to them in the pitch black night. It wasn't until the whole thing was over that police worked out why he was able to do this. It wasn't because he had a night scope, he was, in fact, seeing the red glow from the transmission lights on their radios. Each time they clicked to send a message or reply to one, the light glowed and Blondie fired.
So, Port Arthur Truth proclaim, without any evidence, that there were multiple gunmen during the massacre. This specific point is so scattered, they cannot even agree upon who the supposed gunman is. There are generally 7 candidates. We have Kelvin James Haynes, you have Ben Overbeek, Kel Hines, David Everett, Michael Dyson, Blondie in camo, or a Mossad operator. Geez, that's quite specific. I wonder if we're going to come back to that. Now, there are only 2 names here that I have actually found to exist. The first is Mike Dyson. Not Mike Tyson, the famous boxer who bit a guy's ears off. No, no, no. What would he know what to do with a gun anyway? He likes pigeons. So, this is
Sorry, what?
He likes pigeons.
So you weren't even making a joke, you were just...
I was just saying a fact! He likes pigeons. Mike Tyson likes pigeons. That's what he did with all his boxing money.
Educational facts with Angus.
Yay! It's gonna be like a rainbow. Yay!
The more you know.
The more you know. Mike Tyson likes pigeons and eating people's ears.
But now an outrageous and very public conspiracy theory has been flagged on Facebook, declaring former policeman Michael Dyson was the gunman.
These people that are involved in this are just raving lunatics as far as I'm concerned. They're showing no sense at all.
So, before I get into this is ridiculous and I'm really scraping the bottom of the barrel here, but I'm trying to explain to you the theory so that you can understand how ridiculous the multiple shooters theory is. So bear with me, okay? So the only source for this claim comes from a decade-old shit YouTube video. And this video claims that Michael Dyson, the head of security for Dyson Security, was the shooter.
Mr. Dyson's only involvement in the case was to search Bryant's home after the massacre.
Because presumably he was a security person and therefore he knew everything about guns. Now, for those eagle-eyed and particularly clever viewers, you might have spotted an obvious contradiction. The video blames an elusive Rick, but the man's name is Michael. they aren't even claiming that someone named Mick did the crime. Because that would be, at the very least, you could say like, oh, their names are kind of the same. It would still be bullshit, but at least it would be something. You know, they are... The video only uses verbal gesture to back up this claim. The guy did it because I think he did. They provide absolutely no evidence.
There's freedom of speech, that's a fair argument, but then there's also the responsibility that comes with that, and someone must be held accountable for what has been put on the internet.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
But I cannot stop there. If you're wearing your glasses, as I wish I was, you might see a watermark on this video that spells out the name Brendan O'Connell Blogspot. So, I looked him up. He was arrested for hate crimes. He was in prison for 18 months because what he did was he walked up to a Jewish family with his camera and said a bunch of slurs to them. And he was awful and he posted it to the internet. So the family were like, hey, that's not nice. And the government agreed and they put him in prison for hate crimes. Now, the worst part about all of this is that every single comment section is like, oh, hashtag free O'Connell, right? And the first article I saw pro O'Connell was like, well, they just played the race card. The man who did a hate crime, his supporters are saying the family that had the hate crime perpetrated against them used the race card. That's not how that works. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that this guy isn't a particularly trustworthy source. And we've already discussed that there is a hell of a lot of anti-Semitism at the base of Port Arthur Truth, so I'm just going to chalk this one up to baseless speculation. Now to a more interesting but equally disrespectful claim. Most of Port Arthur Truth believe that Mr. Kelvin James Haynes was actually the shooter. They use this photo as evidence that he was at Port Arthur during the incident.
I wanted to pause because this image is shared a lot around this community, but no one questions where it came from. After doing a little bit of digging, I believe it is a still from the 29th of April 1996, a still from a program called Nightline.
Good evening to you from Port Arthur.
We see a man who looks like a soldier in an ambulance. Assumably, this ambulance is heading away from Port Arthur. The shot is cut in between two ambulances. The last being a shot of the ambulance arriving at the Royal Hobart Hospital to treat Blondie. So most reasonable people would say that this is a soldier who is protecting the ambulance staff and Blondie from violent persecution. Much like the police who surrounded the entrance to the hospital.
Police threw a heavy security cordon around the Royal Hobart Hospital as the man accused of committing the murders arrived in an ambulance.
This sounds entirely reasonable to me. There is no definitive proof, however, that the man in the ambulance is actually Haynes, though. We just see a grumpy soldier on a national broadcast the day after the massacre.
And what makes this particularly compelling to them is that he died a month after the massacre under mysterious circumstances. And admittedly, this is actually quite compelling. So here, we must discuss the 1996 Black Hawk disaster.
The flight lead, Captain Kel Hales, was in Black 1. It was his first time out leading the squadron on a nighttime counter-terrorist mission with the Special Air Services Regiment.
Not an SAS soldier, mind you, he was a helicopter pilot.
On June the 12th, 1996, about 40 kilometres south of their Townsville base, aircrew from the Army's 5th Aviation Regiment were waiting to take off in 6 Black Hawk helicopters. The SAS had asked Kel Hales to fly a bit lower to mask the approach of the helicopters. When Hales put this suggestion to the operational commander, Major Chris Jamison, he'd been told quite bluntly, "Get that's crazy, mate. It would take a month to practice." As they neared the target, Captain Hales gave the 30-second call. It was a signal for the fire support aircraft to move on ahead, to spray the target area with gunfire in advance of the arrival of the SAS, and to move into their final formation, 3 line abreast with 1 behind. But the 30-second call was given earlier than in the day rehearsal. and the pilots couldn't see their targets.
When advising the other pilots, they advised them to stick to the original formation that they had practiced for a month. Haynes diverted Black Hawk 1 to the left, closing in on Black Hawk 2.
Black 1's rotor blades had struck the body of Black 2. The first blade cut through their fuel tank. Petrol spewed into the aircraft and down onto the hot metal of Black 1 beneath them.
We were about 200 or 300 metres away from the target, I suppose, when there was a bit of a bang behind me. And I looked over my shoulder and the tail rotor flew off the aircraft.
And the whole place lit up. And I just remember thinking, where did that come from? It was like someone had turned the lights on. It was actually Kel crashing behind us and the explosion of his aircraft. I could see the ground.
Only 2 people survived the crash in Black Hawk 1, 7 survived in Black Hawk 2, and a total of 18 were killed because of this accident. Black Hawk 3 managed to land upright despite losing rotor function and spinning out. This saved numerous lives.
Dave Burke, he put her on the ground, and the aircraft, she stood up the impact. If it had been any other aircraft, then I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
All 4 of the aircrew from Black Hawk 2 survived the crash, but 7 out of the 11 SAS soldiers who'd been travelling in the back perished that night.
This event is known as the worst military disaster happening on domestic soil in Australian history. It was due to human error. An inquiry into the incident found several systemic issues leading to this crash. It was not one individual incident, but a chain of miscommunications, underfunding, and mistakes. Further, the survivors of this incident do not claim that this chain of mistakes are sufficiently linked to lay blame on any person or group of people.
The conclusion they reached was later backed by a full board of inquiry. There was conflicting evidence, but on balance they found that Captain Hales had turned his aircraft right and flown into Black Hawk 2. But the inquiry did not just blame the dead pilot.
The inquiry is now open.
The full military board of inquiry sat for 3 months. It took evidence from over 140 witnesses. The board found that the accident was inevitable. The Board of Inquiry's report lists the mistakes and errors of judgment that it found in the conduct of the mission. The list includes poor and rushed planning, failure to gather accurate data about the target area, changing the mission between the day rehearsal and the night run, choosing a target that was too hard to locate under NVGs, appointing an inexperienced flight lead for such a difficult mission. It's the most dangerous flying that the pilots do.
It's been well documented that we only get the chance to lead up 2 weeks beforehand and exercise twice a year. And it's difficult to maintain our skills. The skills that we need for these exercises deteriorate in between. NVG flying relies as much on recency as it does on qualification.
So let's begin to comprehend this. Pats allege that Haynes was the Port Arthur shooter, or at least one of them. This would be one thing if the helicopter had crashed with him in the back of it, but Haynes was the pilot. He would have to crash the helicopter himself, not guaranteeing that he would die in the process, let alone convincing him to do this in the first place would be incredibly difficult.
As they left to pick up the SAS, Kel Hales gave David Burke an invitation to his wedding.
And when I opened it up, a lot of confetti fell out of it all over my lap and everywhere. He just laughed and I looked at him and I just said, "Come on, mate, I'm supposed to go flying with the SAS. What will they think of me if I'm covered in confetti?"
If you then claim the government gave him false information to crash the plane, this still doesn't correlate to him dying. He could have survived. Furthermore, there were 17 other fatalities in this incident. These people were expensive to train, they needed to be replaced, and undoubtedly this would spark an investigation. Which there was. If you wanted to covertly take out this shooter, why would you take him out during the biggest peacetime military disaster in Australian history? So, all of this is to imply that Haynes was at Port Arthur during the incident. Now, first of all, the only proof that Pats have is this blurry clip that someone who might kind of look like Haynes from the news footage. He looks like a guy. He looks like quite generic. Someone looking similar to him does not prove a conspiracy. To prove he was there on the day, you would need to uncover documents saying that he was the shooter. You might have military files that you would have to uncover, deployment letters or something. even so, you would still have to prove that he was the shooter, just because, hypothetically, and even though he definitely wasn't, he might have been in the area or the state, doesn't mean he did the shooting. You have to prove in a court of law that someone was at the place and did the thing. It could just be a coincidence. But it's not, because he wasn't, because all the proof you have is a shit photograph. And secondly, there are plenty of other reasons why someone of the Australian Defence Force might be at the site of the massacre in an ambulance. As a reminder, Port Arthur Truth believes that the media were in on the conspiracy. They are seemingly trying to cover up for what the government has done. So if that's the case, why the hell would they fail to scrub the footage of someone who was supposedly Haynes, then rebroadcast that same image years later? To be blunt, okay? How could an army that was under investigation for underfunding and overworking leading to an incident where helicopters could not fly in a straight line, in a formation, how could they organize the massacre and then keep it quiet for a quarter of a century?
The Army had acquired the Black Hawks in 1989, and 5 years later, the public scandal broke. Between the Army and the Air Force combined, they'd botched the ordering of spare parts and maintenance. At one point in February 1995, only 3 of the 27 Black Hawks based in Townsville were serviceable to fly.
The same army that could not keep secret that they couldn't afford a helicopter part for their Black Hawks, most of them kept on the tarmac for that reason. How could a scandal arise from something so mundane, but nothing from a nationwide cover-up of a massacre? Is the media in on it or not? Is the army trustworthy or not? According to Port Arthur Truth, it doesn't matter.
One of the most fascinating and frustrating things about this case is how Pat's used this program. I am not using this footage just because it is informative or because it features several stills of Hines, but because it is a foundational piece of evidence to Port Arthur Truth. Now that sounds like a cheap joke that purposefully removes the community from its context, but this is not the case. Port Arthur Truth used the Black Hawk disaster without engaging with its content. They use Hines's name and ignore the man who died. And what I find fascinating about this case is that it is the very definition of bullshit evidence. In fact, this is the best example. This documentary is shared in these groups. The community does not consume and then digest the information presented. They only use gesture. The sharing of this video is proof in and of itself. The gesture is a kind of thought-terminating cliche. The real shooter was killed by this, and you're not supposed to argue that it makes no sense that any government would assassinate a man in this way, because they are indifferent to whether or not it is true. You say that's ridiculous, they say, who cares, he did it.
Please leave the families of dead soldiers alone. They are not related to this case at all. I'm going to speak to the non-conspiracy theorists at this moment. You've probably been wondering for a little while why it is that Port Arthur Truth believed that Blondie supposedly showed up at the toll booth, spontaneously stole a car, and then took a hostage. The conspiracy theorists have a pretty simple answer for that. Mind control! Yay! This is the beautiful logic of the conspiracy theorist. To be able to say that he didn't do it, but also if he did do it, it was because of MKUltra, and then not see the contradiction between the two beliefs.
Oh no, it's happening again! Spontaneous combustion! From the government LSD tests.
These experiments have been embedded in pop culture. We think of the Winter Soldier and the Manchurian Candidate as examples. So instead of dismissing this outright as a simple logical fallacy, I want to take a different approach. Let's actually have a look at what MKUltra was. Let's take this as an opportunity to learn about some war crimes.
In her acclaimed book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein discussed dozens of American-backed coups in socialist states during the Cold War. They did this to try to establish free market neoliberal capitalism all around the Third World. We have Indonesia, South Africa, post-Soviet Russia, China, South Korea, Iran. MKUltra, as it stands within pop culture, never quite shedded these connotations of mind control, and it has been co-opted by conspiracy theorists as a catch-all for all of their favourite unsubstantiated inconsistencies. What I find interesting about this specific point is that it is one of the few claims in Port Arthur Truth that has receipts. Pat's claim Blondie was in London in 1995. There, he was MKUltra. They substantiate this with the claim that he was in a city
Hereford, England, which was close to some government building that did an MK Ultra. So I have 2 points to refute this. Firstly, he didn't stay there for very long. To quote Wainwright and Totoro,
increasingly, there were also emerging questions about his behaviour abroad. He had raised suspicions in the city of Hereford, England, when he checked into a hotel, then changed his mind because the room was too hot, and checked into a nearby guest house.
This stay was in 1994, not 95. In fact, in late 1995, the independent trustee in charge of his funds forbade Blondie from travelling internationally because it was draining his funds. In a prison interview with detectives Payne and Warren, Blondie said,
"Unfortunately, I couldn't go on any more trips. Otherwise, I would have gone away in May 1996. I was informed nicely that I wasn't able to go away for a long time, for about 12 months, which upset me greatly. I wasn't able to go on a trip, probably for 6 months, and that was the perpetual trustees, a lady who looks after my money."
Wainwright and Totoro simply and empathetically summarize his feelings about being able to travel.
It seems infernally simple, a natural human desire to have something to do, a role to play in life, something that provides structure to the days and the reason for being. This young man had not only lost the 2 people who understood and tolerated him, but in his mind, has lost the last outlet that allowed him human interaction.
It's generally thought that this greatly contributed to Blondie's motive to commit the massacre. He felt entitled to his inherited wealth, even though his parents gave control of his estate to a private trustee. And when he was no longer allowed to abuse it carelessly, resentment began to take hold of him. I believe this is a far more convincing and understandable argument than an abstract MK Ultra. Secondly, conspiracy theorists do not seem to take into account that brainwashing cannot happen overnight, even if it is possible at all. MK Ultra, originally codenamed Project Bluebird and Artichoke, was a program funded with 25 million American dollars. All it did was torture American citizens and prisoners of war alike. MK Ultra consisted of intense and invasive electroshock therapy. Ewan Cameron headed this project, and by all accounts, he was a real piece of shit. Cameron destroyed people's brains with electroshock therapy, and later, hallucinogens. According to Klein,
Cameron saw shock therapy as a means to blast his patients back into their infancy, to regress them completely. In a 1962 paper, he described the state in which he wanted to reduce patients. There is not only a loss of the space-time image, but a loss of all feeling that it should be present. During this stage, the patient may show a variety of other phenomena, such as a loss of a second language or all knowledge of his marital status. In more advanced forms, he may be unable to walk without support, to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence. All aspects of his memorial function are severely disturbed. To depattern his patients, Cameron used a relatively new device, the Page Russell, which administered up to 6 consecutive jolts instead of a singular one. Frustrated that his patients still seemed to be clinging to the remnants of their personalities, he further disorientated them by uppers, downers, and hallucinogenics. Chlorpromazine, barbiturates, sodium, amytal, nitrous oxide, desoxin, seconal, nembutal, veronal, melicone, thorazine, largatil, and insulin. Cameron wrote in a 1956 paper that these drugs served to disinhibit him, the patient, so that his defences might be reduced.
it was only when Cameron had irreversibly destroyed these people's brains that he attempted to build new personalities out of them. However, by his own methods, he had destroyed the very pathways that are important to learning. His attempts included playing tape-recorded messages while people were awake and asleep. Klein describes his attempts as a cheap joke.
With patients shocked and drugged into a vegetative state, they could do nothing but listen to the messages for 16 to 20 hours a day for weeks. In one case, Cameron played a message continuously for 101 days.
So, all of this was before the CIA got involved. This is just what scientists did back in the 50s. It was an insane time. All Cameron had succeeded in doing was destroying a person's entire notion of being. A fate worse than death. At least when you die, the body does not continue to be tortured. This would have been like torturing a small, helpless animal for pleasure. Brainwashing does not work the way conspiracy theorists think it does. The best way to brainwash someone is to put them in what Alexandria Stein refers to as a disorganized attachment relationship. But then, we are going from the realm of cults, and that is not particularly relevant to MKUltra. At the beginning of the Cold War, the CIA was interested in developing special interrogation techniques, which is what eventually became known as MKUltra. According to Klein, this involved
activities in the first few years of Bluebird and Artichoke resembled those in a tragicomic spy film in which CIA agents hypnotized each other and slipped LSD into their colleagues' drinks to see what would happen. The tests were more like deadly fraternity pranks than serious research, and the results didn't provide the kind of scientific certainty the agency was looking for. The stated goal of this research was not for Western powers to use mind control on prisoners. It was to prepare Western soldiers for whatever coercive techniques they may encounter if they were taken hostage.
MKUltra was not about creating sleeper agents, but it was about torturing people, specifically communists during the Cold War. Cameron's developed techniques were used in some of the biggest war crimes since the Holocaust, in Central America and Indonesia, just to name 2 places. So, what we have learned from all of this is that you cannot just brainwash someone, let alone quickly, and any attempt to do so will destroy any semblance of any human being who was there. In reality, you cannot brainwash somebody overnight. If you try, it takes weeks, months, or even years to start working. You cannot know for sure if it will actually work. Klein has a harrowing interview with a survivor of MKUltra. Her name was Gail Krastma, a woman who was tortured so severely that she lost her short-term memory, and she could not encode new ones. At the time of writing, Gail is part of the patients' rights movement against electroshock therapy. Describing how it felt to lose her memory to these treatments, she said,
"Now I know how Eve must have felt, having been created full-grown out of somebody's rib without any past history. I feel just as empty as Eve."
This is one of the many cases of failed psychedelic and shock treatment torture. This woman was tortured over the course of months, and it left her irreversible and irreparable damage. Do you really think this could have happened to Blondie over the course of a day or 2? I'm being serious. It's fun to speculate about MKUltra in the abstract, but in reality, MKUltra was obscenely cruel and farcical. I find it difficult to even comprehend that someone could be brainwashed so quickly and so perfectly to do a mass shooting in Hobart, Tasmania of all places. I think it is just incredibly strange that any NWO-style group would pick Tasmania as a place to unleash the first stages of some kind of Machiavellian multi-decade standing plan. This is absurd, and I must reiterate, there is not a single piece of evidence that such a group even exists. But at the very least, you have learned a little bit about what MKUltra actually was. With any of my future arguments to have credentials, we have to discuss someone that Port Arthur Truth hates as early as possible.
I think they have credence instead of credentials.
Okay, that was bad. I'm really glad I spent my one take doing that.
It's okay, you can cut from throwing.
For many of my future arguments to have credence, we have to discuss someone that Port Arthur Truth hates. Hates as much as John Howard.
Representing his new lawyer, John Avery, appointed after Bryant had pleaded not guilty 6 weeks ago.
A barrister specialising in criminal law and civil litigation. He practiced in Moona and knew Blondie as a teenager.
I didn't realise that there was any connection, but he quickly told me, "Oh, do you still live in that big house with an oak tree in the front, and does your wife drive a Holden station wagon, and do you drive a white Mercedes?" I said, yeah. And we got talking. I went home and I said to my wife, "Do we know this fellow?" "Oh, yes," she said. "Don't you remember he used to come around as a little boy selling rabbits around the neighbourhood?" And
because of this personal relationship, and Blondie's unwillingness to cooperate with authorities, Mr. Avery took the job and helped to persuade him to change his plea to guilty. This act alone is something that Port Arthur truthers will call out as dodgy. They are very upset over the fact that Blondie's case did not go to trial. This is simply the CSI effect in action. They fail to see that justice is in shades of grey. The Tasmanian legal system does not require a trial, because sometimes a trial is a waste of resources. You can have a hearing and a sentencing without a trial here. That is not a sign of injustice in Tasmania.
I know that you weren't pressuring him, but it was a big thing in what you were trying to do, was to get him to plead guilty to all charges.
It seemed to me from day one that the evidence was so overwhelming and the outcome of a trial would have been so obvious that I was trying to avoid a show trial, a circus, a pantomime, call it what you like, because that would have been an absolute stupidity, but it also involved having all these witnesses, damaged people, come to court and have to give evidence where the outcome was always inevitable.
If Blondie pled guilty, it would have gone to trial, and since Port Arthur truthers, after 25 years, cannot provide any concrete evidence that Blondie was coerced by the state, I do not think that it is inherently bad that this case never went to trial. Yes, Carleen Bryant did try to persuade him to change his plea, but I'm going to discuss her story in the next episode of this series, so put a pin in her for now. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that Blondie admitted to the massacre. He admitted to owning one of the guns and taking hostage, who was found dead in the burned wreckage of the hotel. Pats cannot dispute that much. At this point, Blondie was in denial and not willing to open up to anyone. Now, this is all very well and interesting, but this doesn't explain exactly why Port Arthur Truth hates this man so much. So, this is the point where I get to tell you that Mr. Avery was later convicted of criminal fraud.
He misappropriated from his legal firm or stole from clients a total of $512,000 over 6 years before being detected by the firm's financial manager and Avery's partner in March 2006.
Because of this, Pats point to his conviction and claim that he was not only financially, but morally bankrupt. They believe he was always corrupt, and he worked with the government to secure a guilty verdict, and then hide evidence. They have no sources to back up these claims. Now, Mr. Avery pled guilty to all 129 counts of stealing, and he was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison. He got out on parole in 2012. He admitted to what he did, and he served his time. Avery has since retired, and it is certainly unfortunate that this happened. Chief Justice Ewan Crawford said during sentencing,
"Crimes of this kind shake the security and confidence of the public and cause considerable harm to the reputation of the legal profession."
I've come out the other end. It's been a struggle at times, but you get on with life, you take the knocks and you move on. As I said, those 4 years in jail, at times I hated myself. I'd been on a course of self-destruct. I'd put my legal career in jeopardy. I'd put my marriage in jeopardy. I'd totally fucked up. Fortunately, I've got what's best and still got it. So I don't think it's courageous. It's probably just at last wanting to do the right thing.
I believe that Pats see this as a black or white issue. He was once corrupt, therefore he was always corrupt. This is a deterministic argument. However, I think there's a more interesting argument that could be made here. That better argument would be one of financial incentive. The idea here is that John Avery had character for being money hungry.
He embezzled $500,000 from his law firm to buy art, a passion that became an addiction.
The sensible argument would be that his conviction is proof that he is willing to break the law to secure personal funds, thus making him more likely to accept a corrupt government bribe. On first impression, this argument seems sound, but it falls apart under light examination. We have to try and understand his fraud conviction. In this case, he was found guilty by lawyers representing an independent client. They had no incentive to cover up the massacre, and if they were able to secure a harsher punishment for the defendant, they would most likely bring up the fact that Avery had committed malpractice before, right? Do you honestly believe that an independent group of lawyers, separate from the government and employed to uphold the law, were either too negligent to search his funds back in 1996, or were also hired by the government to cover up this whole thing? This is a fraud conviction a decade after the incident. If the government was still paying people out hush money, how would that never surface in any subsequent court cases, or be investigated by any commission against corruption? Avery's performance as a lawyer has nothing to do with the crime a decade earlier. Avery's performance as a barrister is not up for criticism. You cannot argue that he needed to be a zealous advocate here because acting in his client's best interest does not always mean getting them off scot-free.
Yep.
Can you tell that we ran out of camera battery and we're doing this later? Avery dedicated much of the time of Blondie's hearings to assessing the extent of his mental health issues. Without such attention being paid to the issues that Blondie suffers from, were he to be convicted, he may have been put in more danger than he otherwise would have been without the proper assessment. Mr. Terence Hill was the owner and operator of Guns and Ammo in Newtown prior to the massacre. Amongst his collection of firearms was a Colt AR-15, originally registered to Victorian Police. Over the years, the firearm was passed along to Tasmania Police for firearms training. The theory goes, an officer retired while he still had the gun in his possession. Then, he sold it on to a private collector, which then sold it to Mr. Hill. Blondie purchased his AR-15 from Mr. Hill, per his own admission, along with a lot of ammunition and attachments for the weapon. This wouldn't be particularly notable, except Blondie did not have a gun license. Furthermore, per his own admission, Mr. Hill never checked whether Blondie had a gun license or not.
Did you make out you had a gun license when you purchased them?
No, I never discussed it. I just said I had cash on me. And he said it's alright.
According to his own admission, he also bought other guns through the Mercury. I guess it's case closed as to where he got his guns from. But Port Arthur Truth is not satisfied with that. They believe that Mr. Hill was somehow made the second patsy of this case. I can only imagine that the head of the NWO closed his eyes and threw a dart at a board that landed on Mr. Hill's face. This is one of the few claims that has a paper trail, though. To preface, I will treat this letter as if it were real, but there is also a chance that it is not. So I do this as a gesture of good faith. In June 1996, Mr. Hill received a letter from John Avery. This letter stated that the police may have serious evidence of him selling the gun to Blondie without a gun license, which would obviously leave him liable to potential criminal sentencing. We know these claims had some weight behind them because his store was subsequently shut down after the massacre. However, the letter states that police were willing to indemnify Mr. Hill from prosecution if he were to come forward and give evidence that he did not check for a gun license. Pats read this letter as threatening Mr. Hill, forcing him to admit to something he presumably didn't do. So this is a big point within the movement. However, they completely misread the letter. The text of the letter twice states that Mr. Hill needs to think very carefully to consider his position. In layman's terms, this sounds threatening under the right subtext. You imagine a mob boss making an offer you couldn't refuse. However, in standard legalese, this is simply and plainly stating that Mr. Hill does genuinely need to consider his position, either to come forward with evidence and be exonerated, or refuse to and risk legal consequences. Offers of indemnity are not uncommon in criminal or civil cases. If a potential witness may have evidence that is very pertinent to the case, or it is determined that solving the case is more important than prosecuting the witness, indemnity is often considered the best option. You offer one person legal immunity in order to streamline the legal process and solve a larger case. Pats make it out as if Avery himself was the one creating this letter, in a vacuum, when that is not in the defense's power to do that. Again, reading the text of the letter, it is clear that representatives from both sides were present at the police headquarters in question. Now, in a court case, legal representatives will not simply lock themselves away from opposition and then try to predict their arguments. They will meet up, talk about the case off the books, try and understand how to best approach the case so it can be properly litigated. Mr. Avery sending this letter is an example of this. He knows police may have evidence against Mr. Hill, so he is forewarning him so that he knows whether or not he should come forward. This is not a threat, it is legal notification. To conclude, this argument is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happens in court. They are pretending that Mr. Hill was forced into admitting something he didn't do, when in reality, the legal system accommodated his crime and he didn't go to prison for breaking the law. Because it helped the legal process continue. That's all it was. Now that we have demonstrated that John Avery was not criminally biased at the time of the Port Arthur Massacre, I believe it is appropriate that we can use evidence provided by him. Wainwright and Totoro gained access to Avery's personal notes pertaining to Blondie's defense case. And at length, Blondie discusses how he wanted to kill the Martins for perceived transgressions against him and his father.
What did you think you were going to get out of it? I mean, you must have known you were going to get caught.
I thought I'd either get caught or get killed, and I thought of killing the Martins. I thought that if I killed the Martins, I'd go to jail for life, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I kill a lot of people, it won't really make much of a difference.
In other words, if you kill 10, it's not much difference as far as the time in jail for killing one person.
That's right.
And the reason he chose the 28th of April specifically was because it was David Martin's birthday. That's it. Remember Foucault? Truthers are also very upset about the fact that the government locked away the police case files for 75 years in 2016. They argue that this is proof of a cover-up. This is somewhat of an understandable argument. It makes somewhat logical sense to believe that they would lock the files away to protect everyone who was supposedly involved in the conspiracy. Gosh, if only there was someone I could talk to who has experience with dealing with the Port Arthur case files. I wonder if I knew anyone like that. Well, this is where I get to introduce Miss Nikki Otavi. Otavi was in charge of archiving these files for police. Let me reiterate. She was in charge of archiving the police files from the Port Arthur Massacre in 1996 for historians. She moved them from floppy disks, old PowerPoint presentations. For the sake of archiving, she's read all of the archive. It's not true to say she's read all of the files.
Read many of them.
She had to archive them. I first heard about Nikki when she gave a talk at an archiving conference in 2018.
In 2009, the Tasmanian Police transferred their records to the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office, or TAHO as it was called then. I can still remember the day it arrived. There was talk amongst TAHO staff about how we had never received a set of records like this in our time as archivists, and how we didn't really want to open any of the boxes. We knew it contained videos and photographs. I was duty archivist on the day and registered it into our system. It became known as Transfer 2900. At the time we decided it would sit on the shelves where we worked out what to do. There were some attempts at the time by the Manager of Government Record Keeping to work out a way of transferring the files from the 3¼ floppies to a digital format and locking them down securely so they could not be accessed due to the sensitivity of the subject matter. He discussed this with our IT people, but it all seemed a little too difficult and was not resolved. Other tasks took over and nothing was progressed.
In this talk, she explains that the case being closed from public viewing is standard procedure. So, before the comments were shut off, conspiracy theorists, finding out why the case had been shut down for public viewing, were still very upset that they couldn't view the case files. They are given an answer as to why the public is not allowed to see the files, and they refuse to take it in. So, since Nikki Otavi works part-time for the Hobart Library, I thought I would go ask her myself.
After making my inquiry at the library, I received an email and phone call from Mrs. Otavi. Before I get started, I want to extend a sincere thank you to her. She's a busy woman, and I was grateful for her time. I was fascinated by our conversation, but if I were to write out the entire transcript, we'd be here for another half hour. So, in summary, Otavi has worked as an archivist for over 20 years. She mainly deals with government files. Port Arthur was exceptional. In her speech, she goes into the logistical and human problems that she and her team had to solve in the 3-year process of archiving all of the police files. I highly recommend that you give her talk a watch if you're interested in this topic. The main thing that I was interested in is what is called an E45 classification. As Otavi explains it, there are 5 grades of classification under archivist legislation, A through E35. An E45 is the highest, and as they descend, they represent a lower level of classification. To get access to an E45, you have to get permission from the police commissioner. No one can access these files without their permission. It is locked off for all public and private viewing. Not even police officers can look at it. This is done to respect the privacy of the victims, to prevent any kind of trauma from reoccurring, and because it features highly sensitive information. Violent imagery is not meant to be for public consumption. She also reiterated that an E45 is not out of the ordinary. It occurs in most mass casualty events and violent crimes. Otavi says that Port Arthur was not unique in that respect, and in her opinion, it was totally appropriate to apply an E45 to those files. I then asked her what the difference between a D45 and an E45 was, and she gave me a brilliant analogy.
Imagine, if you will, that your father, at some point in his life, was arrested for a crime before you were born. He has since died, and you are curious about what happened to him in that case. You could make an application to the police commissioner or the archivist office to view those files. The law recognizes that sometimes individual people have the right to view information that relates to them. Otavi says that in this case, the applicant would most likely be successful. An applicant would more than likely be rejected if they were not related to the case. Otavi quipped to me that if you were just to request to see a similar file about someone who you went to school with, then you're just being a sticky beak. While a D45 might be graphic, people can be allowed to view it on a case-by-case basis. And a D45 also means that a police officer could view the individual case, whereas with an E45 classification, you are more than likely not going to be able to see these files because it was a mass casualty event. So for example, we don't often hear people whinging about how they can't view photos from the people that Ivan Milat killed, because these are pictures and videos from a crime scene, and it was not open to public consumption. Any transcripts of meetings held back in 1996 are generally not allowed to be viewed because they are packaged together with the more graphic files. Pats will disregard the fact that this is just standard procedure, but that is what it is. As I will discuss in the next chapter, the one piece of footage from the massacre that did leak out caused massive trauma to Tasmanians and victims alike. And I don't want Pats to have the ability to spam survivors with pictures of their dead loved ones. Otavi said that she feels a lot of professional pride from her work in this case. It was by far and away the most challenging case she ever had to deal with.
While I was doing this, I came across a statement which was a little different to the others. It was different in that it wasn't written in discussion with police. Police statements are just that, statements of fact, as they should be. No emotion, just fact. One person in the Broad Arrow Cafe at the time of the shooting had been too traumatised to talk to the police. On their return home, they started writing down what they had seen and what they felt, and they sent it to police. They described the scene in the cafe, the conversations with others as they tried to help those injured. They waited for help and did what they could. There was the added fear that the gunman may return. It wasn't an overly dramatic statement, it just told the story. But it brought home the humanness to this transfer of records. I sat at my desk with tears in my eyes. If ever there was a moment where I needed reminding why archivists do what we do, here it was right in front of me. I couldn't do anything for them except to make sure their account of what happened that day was preserved. Thank you.
So I hope that this section has illuminated some facts for you as to why the case has been shut down. It is standard procedure, and it is not a remarkable thing. Oh, that's disgusting. As established in Part 1, Chapter 3, Blondie inherited a lot of his wealth. He travelled the world, bought firearms, and generally annoyed people to excess. Conspiracy theorists ask the question that you may be wondering at this point. What exactly happened to all that money? It's quite a simple answer, actually. It was given to the victims as compensation. After the massacre, the Tasmanian government proposed new legislation allocating the funds as compensation. I haven't talked much about the victims in this case as of yet, as I plan to do that at length later on in this episode. But a great place to start is to talk about the establishment of the Port Arthur Victims Appeal Front, PAVAF. This was first established on the 29th of April, 1996, and it started with just $100,000. Even if we consider inflation, that was not a lot of money. This initial cash fund was supposed to cover emergency costs like funeral or travel expenses. Over time, a committee was established to raise more money for victims. This money was gathered, according to Margaret Scott,
from the federal government, the governments of other Australian states, banks, sporting clubs, a publisher, a TV network, and thousands of private citizens. A songwriter and singer contributed the proceeds from the sale of a CD. A group of children in an after-school care program raised $14,000.
Later that June, the committees had paid out close to $300,000 of compensation for travel and funeral expenses. By November, $3.25 million had been contributed to the Victims' Appeal Fund, which consisted of workers' compensation. According to Scott,
just before Christmas, the Supreme Court ruled that part of Blondie's assets, worth over $1 million, should be forfeited to the state. It also signalled in January that his share in the estate of George Adams, a further $600,000 or so, was to go the same way. The federal government added to the money available for Bryant's victims by waiving some $250,000 worth of income tax for his fortune.
Conspiracy theorists will allege that this is immoral because they believe Blondie was innocent and thus the government stole his fortune. I word my response very carefully. So, if it was removed from context, I think I basically agree with them. Seizing a person's wealth before they have been found guilty is immoral, and abusing civil forfeiture laws is a common problem that disproportionately affects the working class. But we cannot ignore the context, and I quite strongly disagree with this sentiment because, as Scott describes, he was found guilty and only then did the state use the fortune to compensate victims. Truthers seem to believe that the government just pocketed the money, much like how a big CEO might score a big bonus. But it did not function like that, because it was given to the victims. For this line of argumentation to work, you have to believe that every single person on the site was a secret government agent, which is false. Much of the compensation went to travel and funeral fees for the families of the dead and injured. Individual payments were given to some of the victims, an amount ranging from $15,000 to $25,000, but the victims did not want money in the first place. Their family members had just been killed. Secondly, truthers argue that the law amendment was immoral. They specifically believe that the victims were not entitled to Blondie's money. And this sounds callous, because it is. This is not a conspiracy theory, it's a matter of personal opinion. The libertarian notion that victims should not receive reparations from the perpetrator is purely a philosophical opinion that rides upon this specific case. I disagree, and they need to come up with a more nuanced argument than, I personally don't believe the money should have been given to them. This is a big point for Pats, but they do not know how to articulate it properly. So, Port Arthur truthers do not believe that it was a coincidence that Blondie chose Tasmania's most popular tourist attraction. And guess what? It was not a coincidence. Blondie confessed that he chose the site because he thought there would be a lot of people there. They claim that the historic site staff were in on the conspiracy for monetary gain, right? So whether that be in the form of personal bribes, extra money for the site, or a boost in tourism sales, these are all ridiculous assertions, and I will explain each one in detail. Firstly, we must acknowledge that this is an accusation, and the burden of proof lies on the truthers. They must uncover any bank transfers or illicit funds given to members of the historic site management. But I'm feeling nice. Let's say that the members all got a fat check from Howard the Coward! The short-term gain of this would be quickly lost once the shooting happened. A government does a conspiracy with the implicit goal of keeping it a secret, right? So, it would be smart enough to predict some of the consequences beforehand. It also makes sense that the historic site management would have to be in on it for the sake of coordination. The Howard government and the historic site management therefore must have foreseen severe socioeconomic consequences for staging the biggest spree shooting at that point in history. They will have predicted that they must have lost money for the foreseeable future and that the local economy would have been left in shambles. For the management of a kind of for-profit private company, why in their right minds would they agree to lose money and then further along their jobs managing one of Tasmania's most treasured historic sites? The staff lose their jobs, their power, their security, and then their equity. All for a supposed individual check that does not exist. So a counterpoint to this is we might say John Howard wanted to give money to the historic site, right? So this claim has something of a precedent. Shortly after the massacre, John Howard pledged $1 million to revamp the visitors center. When you visit the historic site today, the building that you first enter was built with John Howard money. Pats point to this transaction as proof that the staff agreed to stage the shooting if they got the money to develop the site. And I could see how someone could come to this conclusion. The massacre would make for a socially acceptable cover to transfer the funds to the historic site. But this argument is still severely flawed. It relies on an implicit connotation that the historic site was desperate for money, right? And as I mentioned earlier, the historic site was not starving for cash. The government-owned for-profit company that ran the site was one of the most profitable in the entire state. They received a substantial amount of money from the state government for maintenance, and the business made more than enough money to get by. They didn't need the money from the grant to build the visitors center. They were already rich. The third and final argument alleges that the historic site was motivated to boost tourism for the site. So, Port Arthur would hit the world headlines, leading to millions of dollars of free tourism advertising. And this idea to me is the most ridiculous. They are ignorant of the wider socio-economic problems that the massacre created. So according to Carol Altman, the state of Tasmania would lose tourist amounts for 4 years after the massacre. The entire region of Port Arthur was not only emotionally, but financially devastated in its wake. It turns out that having a mass shooting in Port Arthur makes people not want to holiday at Port Arthur. Pats look at the historic site within a bubble. They will respond, okay, yeah, sure, for the first few months people won't want to go down there, but due to morbid curiosity, people would come out in force to see the site. Now, there are two main responses to this argument that I have. Firstly, this ignores the socio-economic consequences that a false flag taking place in Port Arthur had not only on the historic site, but the peninsula area as a whole. Tourism in all of Tasmania went down significantly, and according to the former mayor of the peninsula, Neil Noy,
the peninsula was hurting bad. The shops were suffering, the accommodation places were suffering, the vegetable and fruit growers who supplied these industries were suffering because nobody was moving here. Nobody was staying here. There were people in Hobart, even friends of mine, who wouldn't come down here for a long, long time. People were really terrified, yet Port Arthur wasn't the problem, it was one man.
The argument is ludicrous because the peninsula barely survived the massacre. Even if more tourists still came out to the historic site, the area would become less of a draw because there was a chance that due to the financial devastation, there might not be a community there anymore. Every single book I have read on the topic of the Port Arthur Massacre details in one form or another the economic devastation that Port Arthur endured. When you're a conspiracy theorist, you tend to think within the big picture and you obsess over small details that implicate guilt, while ignoring every single piece of information that doesn't support your worldview. When we think about 9/11, for example, we don't think about how the local tourism industry and local businesses suffered economically after the attacks. Likewise with Port Arthur, you never see any Pats discuss the tragedy of the peninsula, the divorces, the mental health breakdowns, the suicides, and anything else that was bad that occurred as a result of Port Arthur. The second response is this. There is an argument to be made that infamy definitely added to Port Arthur's reputation. The phenomenon of dark tourism is not new, but there is definitely a market for people who would want to enter the site specifically to see where Australia's worst spree shooting happened. In the process of making this documentary, we entered the site ourselves to understand the layout of the site better and to get B-roll. But this argument doesn't work because Port Arthur was already a dark tourist spot. I mean, it was already the site of one of Australia's most brutal convict prisons, right? Port Arthur doesn't hide the fact that its prison was a quagmire of death, pain, suffering, lashings, and beatings. The management built its site's reputation on its brutality. The island where they buried prisoners was called the Isle of the Dead, for heaven's sake. Pats believe 1, 2, or 3 of all these, depending on the person. Each argument doesn't work on its own merits. But it doesn't work especially when you consider that all of the members of the historic site management were replaced by the end of 1996. These people were running the historic site for profit. If they wanted to keep their jobs at one of the most profitable private businesses in Tasmania, why would they orchestrate a massacre knowing full well they would lose their jobs? The answer is they wouldn't, right? They were the ones in charge of keeping their jobs. It's foolish. Pats will point to the fact that the management was away at some kind of conference in Swansea. They don't know it was Swansea. I know it was Swansea because I read the goddamn paperwork. So, they see it as some nebulous conference that was an excuse for them to not be on site, right? But I think that the fact that they were away is actually a point against the movement. Okay, let's pretend for a second that the site was in on it. I think that the management would want to be seen as heroes. They would want to be seen as paragons of leadership, looking after the site when literally all hell had broken loose. If it was a hired hitman with precision headshots and instructions, the hitman would know not to shoot the management. And by following truth or logic to its conclusion, their own reasoning works against them. Conspiracy theorists are using an inductive argument here. They're saying if the management wasn't there, then they must have been away for a nefarious reason. But there is an obvious leap of logic here. There is no inherent nefarious reason that they were away. It was for a management course being run up in Swansea. First, the burden of proof here is again on the theorist. They have to prove that no such thing occurred. Secondly, you also have to prove that they were being taken away specifically so they would not be shot on sight. Inductive arguments are not good enough reasons to validate a theory. You couldn't pass Year 1 philosophy with that. This argument is neither sound nor true. This is a set of facts that is merely circumstantial to the incident. There are plenty of reasons to criticize the management. For instance, mere months after the massacre, catering staff were forced to use the Broad Arrow Cafe kitchen. Management even tried to make them sign a waiver to return to work and not sue the management for any PTSD or trauma faced upon re-entering the premise. Let's talk about the people who saved lives inside the cafe being permanently traumatized, and because they weren't physically harmed, they were not entitled to compensation. Let's talk about Mark Kirby, a site labourer who was doing maintenance on top of the grounds cherry picker during the massacre and was denied workers' compensation, and then denied counselling for the trauma he faced from cleaning up after the massacre. Pats tend to want to focus their energy on a single incident undertaken by management, which can be easily substantiated and explained. Rather than considering any significant issues that have been undertaken, they will cherry-pick individual incidents that play along with their versions of events, and let the evidence so happen to mould around it. Criticism of the historic site management is not unwarranted. I believe they should have been criticised significantly more, even though they all lost their jobs in 1996. But criticising them for not being there at the time of the massacre is playing into mere coincidence. And speaking of coincidences,
a Royal Australian College of Surgeons course on early management of severe trauma was in progress, so the hospital's directors of emergency medicine and surgery, as well as others involved in the course, were immediately available.
Port Arthur truthers believe that this cannot be a coincidence, and it must have been orchestrated so all of these doctors would have been at the Royal to treat the wounded, and it is undeniably a coincidence. But when you stop to really think about it with your brain, instead of all of your emotions and you're all angry, the existence of this coincidence works against Port Arthur truth. Ask yourself, what's the purpose of a false flag attack? It is to create as much damage as you can to justify a sudden and dramatic government response. Whoever was behind the attack must have wanted as many casualties as possible. That means there would have been less doctors, less people who could have been deployed to save the wounded, right? And I would firstly like to point out this quote from Altman's book about the Royal Hobart Hospital's response.
While most of the interstate doctors involved in the severe trauma management course had already caught flights home, several of the local doctors suddenly found themselves shifting from theory to practice in the space of a few hours.
So, the accusation that the doctors were mainly there to save the wounded is obviously false. Most of them had already gone home. The hospital staff was informed that there would likely be more than 20 trauma patients. Under Brian Wapol's direction, they mustered 70 emergency staff. Code Brown was activated, and a team of plastic surgeons, neurosurgeons, orthopedic and vascular surgeons, anesthesia surgeons, general surgeons were put into teams to treat them, and no one died under their care.
There was an absolute team of medical people, and they ran me along that corridor. And I can remember these eyes looking at me over their masks.
By 9 PM, as the patients settled and the immediate chaos gave way to quiet, Brian Wapol was able to go home.
This was the response of the underfunded Royal Hobart Hospital, and it was essentially perfect. Only after the massacre did the state government really start to see the value in the hospital. In my opinion, their response being this excellent actually runs counter to the Port Arthur truther narrative, that the government wanted to create the most amount of carnage and death. It would not be a good sign that there was a conference of trauma doctors there. It was incredibly good luck. It is not actually in Pat's favour that Code Brown had been completed after 8 months in review, because the quality of care saved lives. If it were the government's aim to kill at least 35 people, why the hell would they stop there? It would have been significantly more tragic if people died on the way to hospital or in hospital. How does this help their evidence of conspiracy, that the government saved lives after the supposed false flag? It would be a paradox if Pat actually stopped to think about it for more than 2 seconds. It did not take me too long to come to that conclusion. It's simple logic. So, how can you hold these two cognitively dissonant beliefs? The historic site did it for the money, and then the hospital did it for the money, even though the outcome would have had to have been different for either side to profit, right? And yet both sides would need to be in cahoots to make it work. Ultimately, Pats don't really care about the supposed goals of the management or the hospital. This is where I'd like to introduce you to the fact that conspiracy theorists are not skeptical about specific points of a specific narrative. They are just skeptical. According to Wood et al. In Dead and Alive, Beliefs in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories,
in Study 1, the more participants that believed that Princess Diana faked her own death, the more they believed that she was murdered. In Study 2, the more participants believed that Osama bin Laden was already dead when the US Special Forces raided his compound in Pakistan, the more they believed he is still alive. Hierarchical regression models showed that mutually incompatible conspiracy theories are positively associated, because both are associated with the view that the authorities are engaged in a cover-up. The monological nature of conspiracy belief appears to be driven not by conspiracy theories directly supporting one another, but by broader beliefs supporting conspiracy theories in general.
The ultimate goal of a belief such as this is not to substantively come to the most logical conclusion. Rather, it is to substantiate a belief in any alternate narrative. A conspiracy theory of this nature doesn't focus on one particular theory as evidential proof, but it draws from multiple different sources to disprove what it believed to be the truth. To this extent, Port Arthur truthers tend to believe in multiple contradictory theories in order to prove that a conspiracy exists. It's nonsense. So the argument here is silly, and it is generally touted by people who don't know much about this case, but I would be remiss to not mention it. So they state, how could he drive if he didn't have a license? Oh my, I can't believe you just debunked the entire theory. You know what? It is true. He didn't have a driver's license. He still drove though. He admitting to owning an AR-15, but he didn't have a gun license. He knew how to shoot, he knew how to drive, he was just afraid of failing the driver's test, so he never went for it. Blondie drove around all the time. To the beach to sit on the sand to pretend he was a surfer. Into town to tell people he was a successful businessman. And wherever else, he wanted to make people uncomfortable. Police weren't strict on driver's licenses back then. Just because he didn't have one, it didn't stop him from driving around. He would go on to kill 35 people. Illegally driving doesn't seem to have that much cadence in this case. Here's another interesting coincidence for you. The former Premier of New South Wales, Barry Unsworth, was once quoted in 1987 saying,
"It'll take a massacre in Tasmania before we get gun law reform in Australia."
Port Arthur truthers point to this prophetic prediction of this former Labour Premier as proof. Well, proof of what exactly? Well, they tend to fall into two camps, right? So the first being that politicians were in on it, which is dumb and false. This is in direct contradiction to the Howard the Coward is power-hungry narrative that these people have set up. Howard would not have been elected for another 8 years at this point. This tends to be the radical cluster who believe that the NWO constructed the massacre, or this is an observation of what needed to happen for Australia to achieve gun reform. Port Arthur did not need to happen. This was a horrific tragedy, and then treating it like a game of 4D chess is an incredibly disrespectful and insensitive position that minimizes the suffering of victims. Pats also take Mr. Unsworth out of context. What they won't tell you is that this was said in the context of a failed gun control conference in 1987, in which a proposed gun control law was blocked by a Tasmanian representative. Mr. Unsworth later recalled to the Daily Mail,
"And Bob Hawke said to me, 'We're not getting anywhere. Go out and speak to the media.' I stood in front of the steps of Old Parliament House in Canberra and I said, 'We're just not getting anywhere.' And I was mindful of the fact the main objector was the Tasmanians."
Mr. Unsworth later admitted that he regretted making these comments, according to the Daily Mail.
Mr. Unsworth said in his 1987 comments were made during an era when automatic and semi-automatic machine guns were selling in gun shops for $295.
Pointing towards this quote as evidence is dishonest. It is nothing more than an unfortunate comment that came true. This kind of coincidental phenomenon has been referred to as the Simpsons effect. Namely, we don't remember every single potentially predictive quote that every politician has gotten wrong. But when one unfortunately comes true, it is noteworthy because it feels prophetic. This is simply confirmation bias. And again, it is merely a non sequitur. This is irrelevant. Pats will often turn to the testimony of Mr. Ian Kingston, a survivor who said he didn't recognize Blondie when he first entered the parking lot. They use this as evidence of misidentification. The argument is, it couldn't have been Blondie, someone who knew him was there, and he didn't recognize him. What they get wrong is how selectively they quote Ian Kingston. Despite what they claim, these groups don't actually do a lot of fact-checking. They assume that their fellow theorists are correct and they've done their research. So when they speak, they don't have to be terribly critical of any evidence. Mr. Kingston was in fact directing traffic. He was interviewed for the program Crimes That Shook Australia.
I was sort of coordinating parking around lunchtime when I drove in. Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured.
Now that we have provided this context, we can understand that he was busy doing his job. He also couldn't be expected to remember every face from his past perfectly, especially considering it had been many years since he'd last seen him and Blondie had changed. Mr. Kingston then told Blondie where to park. Blondie ignored him, and frustrated, Kingston went on with his work. He observed that Blondie seemed to have missed the ferry. He saw him go into the back of his car, grab his sports bag, saw him muck about in the boot, watched him go over to the Port Arthur Cafe, eat a meal, and then re-enter the cafe. He then heard the gunshots. He thought initially that it might have been a bloody electrical fault, so he went towards the cafe. He then entered and saw Blondie shooting the occupants, and he fled to safety. He also says there was only one gunman, and he saw Blondie committing the act of violence. Mr. Kingston would later take charge until police arrived, according to Margaret Scott.
Kingston was trying to establish a form of command post in the information centre. He spoke to the police, impressing on them the need to find the gunman and prevent him returning to the site, rather than coming home immediately in force to Port Arthur.
This decision will be discussed at length later. We must understand that civilians did not know where Blondie was, nor whether he was returning. Later in the interview of Crimes That Shook Australia, Mr. Kingston directly shames Port Arthur Truth, bluntly stating,
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and didn't do it, and the government set him up, and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit, because there was nothing like that, and I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what happened. And I don't know where these stories originate and how they get going. It's just a load of rubbish, you know.
Most of Port Arthur Truth take a very cold stance that they do not believe that no one did anything during the initial attack in the Port Arthur Cafe. This feels particularly cruel to me. It feels very American. Some commenters claim that none of this would have happened would someone in the cafe have had their own gun, which is ridiculous. According to the podcast Case File, after he left the historic site, Blondie attacked a petrol station. The owner ran to get his rifle, but before he could load it, people were dead and Blondie escaped. You cannot be prepared for a surprise shooting. He's not Cowboy. You know what I mean? Like, he's not just gonna be like, oh, he doesn't always have his hand on his gun waiting to shoot someone. It's a surprise! More guns are not the solution here. Secondly, we have to discuss the 4 Fs. You likely know about fight or flight, in which a person's reaction to danger is to run away, flight, or to face it head on, fight. We speak less often of the other 2 Fs, fawn and freeze. The 4th is freeze. This is where your body ceases to function out of fear. Too much information is coming into your brain, so you just pause and attempt to figure out the best option.
One of the survivors of the massacre has given a chilling first-hand account of the horror of Sunday afternoon. Peter Croswell told how he escaped the gunman in the cafe where the massacre began.
It takes time to react to it. You can't think it through, you just react to it. And some people reacted by running, other people reacted by hiding cupboards.
Mr. Croswell jumped onto the 2 women he was with, Pamela Law and Thelma Walker, camp quality puppeteers from Sydney. They all lay on the ground, terrified, as the shots kept coming.
A lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
This man did something during the most traumatic moment of his life. He received a bravery award from the government, and quite infuriatingly, I have seen Port Arthur Truthers question his conduct. They will point to his interview and say, well, he specifically didn't mention Blondie, therefore that proves our position. This man was in hospital, he had never seen Blondie before. Why would he mention the shooter specifically? I've even seen people on 8kun say that he did it for fame.
I won't be going back down to Port Arthur. That's not for me. It's a decision an individual will make for whatever reason.
Mr. Croswell was asked why he wouldn't attend the 20th anniversary commemoration. In the same article, he says,
I have images, smells, that make up the whole deal of what happened down there. I tend not to dwell on them too much.
This man has severe PTSD from being shot several times in the cafe. If he did it for the fame, then why didn't he go back for the anniversary? Say, just for a moment, that Blondie wasn't actually there. Why would you still attack this man? He's a survivor. To continually attack him for voicing his irritation with conspiracy theorists is quite frustrating. According to survivor Wendy Scurr, said that one man did try to stop Blondie. He was consequently shot in the face and neck. Another threw a tray at Blondie to attempt to stop the attack. They too were shot and killed on the spot. Another source that Port Arthur truthers will point to is the testimony of one eyewitness. Now, it depends on who you actually ask in this movement who this eyewitness was. Sometimes he's a victim of the bus attacks, or other times he was in the cafe. Some people claim that he's a soldier. This point is weird because they don't even agree on who the person who said this was, but this random person said the attacker who he saw had acne on his face. Jeez, that's like the title of the TV show. No way! A pock-marked face with freckles. So this is a big point for Port Arthur Truth because Blondie had clear skin at the time of the murders. Now, in my opinion, this is one of three options. The first being that this eyewitness was mistaken. The exact same rules apply for memory that I spoke about in the beach identification paragraph. So secondly, according to all accounts, the killer had been cool, calm, and collected. But even so, he had murdered over 20 people at this point and injured even more. They were all close quarters engagements. Do these people just not understand that blood spray is a thing, right? So if I shot someone at close range, I would likely get blood on me. That times 30 means it's incredibly likely that the shooter was speckled with blood. And since he mainly shot people in the upper body or head, it is further likely that blood would spatter on his face, thus the appearance of acne. It is very curious to me that no one else in the cafe ever described anyone as having a pock-marked face, further concluding for me that this eyewitness was mistaken. Then thirdly, this eyewitness apparently watched as the shooter took shots at other patrons inside the Port Arthur Cafe. He hid behind a counter and occasionally looked out from behind it to see where the shooter was. In a snap reaction from hiding, he'd only caught glances at the shooter. And don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly happy that this man survived. Every life lost in the incident was far too much damage. We do have to consider, though, that the brief glimpses of vision this man got, plus the very bright flashes of gunfire in these moments, may have distorted his vision. For example, searing bright lights can often distort your vision, such as when you glance at the sun, and very briefly, this is burned into your eyesight. So obviously, the awesome power that is the sun is not analogous to gunfire, but with brief flashes and brief glances, this could distort one's vision. Even taking all three of these arguments into account, this does still not ignore the most pertinent piece of information. On the first day and a half of police interviews taking place on the day and the day after the incident took place, around 600 people were interviewed, and the vast majority of corroborated evidence suggests that Blondie had a clear face. If the 30-some survivors in the Port Arthur Cafe uniformly came forward to claim that the shooter had acne, this would be a much larger point of contention. But the testimony of this one man, weighed against hundreds of other positive identifications, is not convincing enough to prove an entire conspiracy. This is merely a statistical outlier. How do I even begin to explain this? This is one of the pillars of the Port Arthur Truth movement. It is incredibly important. Every single source that I've found always brings this up. But it is one of the most tangential things I've ever seen in a conspiracy theory. So I have to cover it. If this was any other conspiracy theory, I wouldn't even feel obliged to mention it. But I have to. The state of Tasmania owned a large mortuary truck. Here's a picture of it. It was bought a few years before the massacre. I think what they're trying to say here is that the truck was bought by the government to transport the bodies from Port Arthur to the Royal. But since this truck had been around before John Howard was elected Prime Minister, it doesn't make sense. Now, if they'd bought this truck in the week before the massacre, that might be up for debate, because Howard was in office then. But he was not. This argument relies upon an NWO-style organization creating a plan years ahead of time. And again, I'm going to need some further evidence to acknowledge this argument, because it's based on absolutely no proof. Please just give me anything. This is why this doesn't work for me. Let's discuss the reasons why a state might actually own a large mortuary truck in the first place. This truck was commissioned in 1994 by the Hobart Mortuary. Pats believe it was custom built for the massacre, and obviously this is nonsense. If it was truly custom built, it would have had over 30 bodies, not 22. Firstly, since Tasmania has several airports and a commercial seaport, it doesn't seem particularly odd to me that we should have a big mortuary truck. Disasters happen. In the event of a plane crash, for example, we would use a mortuary truck to transport the bodies to the morgue. Secondly, in the podcast Those Conspiracy Guys, comedian Damien Clark makes what I think is a pretty good argument, and no less off the top of his head. I refer to it as the cruise ship argument. He posits that cruise ships will frequently host older guests. On board, when COVID isn't ravaging the tourist hotspots. And the likelihood of those older guests getting sick and dying is higher than the average population. It stands to reason that they will need space to hold these bodies. If the onboard morgue fills up, they will need to hold extra bodies in the freezer. Now, Tasmania is one such tourist hotspot, and in times when our borders are more open to such tourists, cruise ships will regularly dock in the state. If such a disaster were to occur on board, there would need to be appropriate measures to safely offload and transport the bodies to the state mortuary, rather than taking too many trips. Thirdly, and arguably the most important point to the Port Arthur truther, is that the mortuary truck was sold some years after the massacre occurred. Pats claim that this truck was sold directly after the massacre, and as such, they infer that the truck's purpose was only for the massacre. Now, this is quite a wild leap of logic. This truck was sold years after, not mere days or weeks. So what they're doing is claiming a coincidental sale is undeniable proof of a conspiracy, and I can't even begin to describe how terrible this leap of logic is. There is no summative effect or direct connection between the two events. If this truck was truly part of a conspiracy, why would the government willingly sell it, rather than destroy it? The advertisement in question states that the truck may hold memorabilia value. This ad is one of the few pieces of evidence that Port Arthur Truth throw around to try and prove conspiracy. But if this truck was being used to cover the true government conspiracy, I do not understand why they would not just destroy the evidence. Imagine tomorrow, right? A whistleblower reveals everything to be true and I'm wrong. Why would the government, that implicitly wants to keep this a secret, decide to allow others to freely hold damning evidence? This leads to my conclusion that the mortuary truck is a non sequitur. It doesn't matter that the state owned a large mortuary truck. By arguing this point, I have to assume that it's important, but it's not. It's like arguing that burning down a local museum was a government conspiracy because they owned fire trucks. It is exactly as logically consistent as that. The fire trucks had nothing to do with the burning it down. It implies they wanted to make it more convenient, right? But mere convenience is not evidence of a conspiracy, right? If a conspiracy had been kept this secret this long, they wouldn't just be concerned about convenience. Jesus. And since we're talking about the mortuary, I thought I would highlight how excellent their response to the incident was. Hobart's mortuary is based in the Royal Hobart Hospital. Therefore, it was up to the Royal to identify the 35 bodies. Now, because the first 32 people were tourists, Seascape had yet to be extinguished at that point, the bodies did not all have identification on them. Many of them had their bags in their cars or on their buses. This made the process of post-mortem identification an incredibly difficult task, which is obviously counter to the false flag narrative. If it was all staged, wouldn't the government want the identification process to be swift and easy? But I digress. Especially when considering many of these people had been shot in the head and at close range, this disfigurement made identification incredibly challenging.
I had the duty of receiving all the dead people into the morgue, so I saw firsthand the shocking wounds that the people who were killed had sustained.
Despite all of the insurmountable obstacles, out of the 35 bodies, they made only one false identification. Absolutely remarkable work. Oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know, guess what? Quite hilariously and infuriating for me, the morgue truck advertisement, the one that they make a massive deal about, one of the pillars of this entire community, is fake. It's a fake ad, and this truck that was not used at Port Arthur. Let that sink in for a moment, okay? I will quote Hazelwood while you attempt to digest it.
There was one barely reported feature of Port Arthur in which Tasmania was in fact leading the rest of Australia in coping with a disaster of this magnitude. After the relevant police investigations, Hobart's government contractor, Ray Charlton, who provides mortuary ambulance services, was called in to help transport the bodies to Hobart. He had two vehicles, an ex-Tasmania Ambulance Service Ford F100, capable of carrying 4 bodies, and a Chevrolet truck to the chassis of which he had attached a refrigerated covered compartment capable of storing 16 bodies. The vehicle was considered by some as an expensive aberration that would never have a use. In fact, I know Mr. Charlton had received a degree of denigrating criticism for some sectors of the community about this vehicle and his job.
According to the coroner Ian Mattison,
in just 2 return trips, the Chevrolet carried the majority of the disaster victims to the mortuary, a task that the otherwise would have required 8 return trips by conventional mortuary ambulance. Mr. Charlton's foresight became a lesson in efficiency. Mr. Matheson wrote, he also went further. The foresight of our mortuary ambulance contractor, in providing a vehicle of more than average size for the purpose of removing the bodies from a disaster site, was of utmost importance in the overall efficiency in clearing the scene.
I think so far that I've made a pretty convincing case that it doesn't matter if the state owned a large mortuary truck. So since the pictured mortuary truck doesn't exist, we can completely disregard this point as ludicrous. Remember, this is fake evidence that upon even the tiniest amount of scrutiny falls apart instantly. Which is why it is so funny to me that it is just fake. It is so important to their narrative, and yet it is so demonstrably false. I would laugh if it was not such a serious matter. I hate the mortuary truck. So up until this point, we have mainly taken theories from people who were not on site and who are purely speculating about what it was like inside of the Port Arthur Cafe. The people who create these theories, for the lack of a better term, desperately want to be involved, right? They want to be able to say, I was directly hurt by this, and then they will selectively quote people to justify these feelings. We do this because we don't like to think about this incident as happening for no reason. It's the whole basis of this entire conspiracy theory. So allow me to illuminate for you what it was like to be a victim.
4 Port Arthur staff who survived the shooting spree today described the terrifying bloodshed. Wendy Scurr was first to call.
This entire section has been worded very carefully, and everything that I say about Scurr comes from the fact that I believe that she was a hero.
I grab bandages, I use basically tea towels as padding. There's very little you can do. I mean, for the injuries that those people had, it was just basically keeping an airway open and keeping it clear and stopping what bleeding you could stop.
Scurr genuinely saved dozens of lives and took charge in Blondie's wake. She was one of the first responders to walk into the Port Arthur Cafe, and until the day she died in 2016, she lived with an overwhelming PTSD. After a couple of years, she could no longer work, and she had to retire young. She reported having terrible nightmares and constant anxiety attacks, which crippled her ability to be social. I wrote in the script that she sacrificed her mental health, but that's not entirely correct. She didn't sacrifice anything. She was traumatized by the Port Arthur Massacre. And we cannot overlook this factor when I come to my criticisms. And I have a lot of criticisms of Scurr, but they all come from a place of respect and genuine concern for a life that was ruined. It's here that we must talk about how Wendy Scurr was one of the most prominent Port Arthur truthers out there, which is what makes this story so interesting to me. I think the best way to start this section is to simply explore Scurr's testimony as she says it, then we can elucidate evidence wherever it rises. So I have 2 main sources for her claims. The first is an extended multi-chapter interview in Carol Altman's book, After Port Arthur. The 2 women became close during their time together, and while Altman is critical of Scurr's belief, she writes about her with astounding empathy. The second source is, much stranger. Scurr gave a rare speech at Interval Forum 2001. We fortunately have footage of Scurr's speech. To give you a taste of what this forum was like, a bloke starts ranting about water fluoridation before introducing Scurr for her speech.
Now, one of the things I've campaigned against personally is fluoridation. And I would far rather have a debate on fluoridation than just speak on fluoridation. I love the opportunity to go up against what is considered to be the best of science, medicine, and dentists and government people in the country, telling us why we should have fluoridation, or rat poison as it's more commonly known in the rural areas, forced down our throats. And this, to the organisers of the Inverell Forum, has always been perfectly as it should be. because this is what freedom of speech is all about.
With these two sources, I shall present you Scurr's candid perspective.
Wendy closes her eyes and pulls on a cigarette as she explains why she believes there was something askew at Port Arthur in the 2 months before the shooting. It began with a tourist who suffered a fatal heart attack on the 3rd of March as he returned to his car after the beating retreat event, a special one-off military-style performance. Wendy, who worked at the site as an information officer, first aid instructor and tour guide, did not know of a similar fatality in all the years the tourist site had been open. Then the trees began to fall down. First, a massive limb from an oak tree, which crashed on the very spot where a large group of people were due to gather 20 minutes later, and under which a couple had not walked seconds earlier. Several weeks later, a towering macrocarpet pine tree came plummeting down, roots and all, again just metres from a tour group. It was enough to give Wendy the creeps. It was as if we were being prepared for something, and to inspire her to organise a mock emergency to test the first aid skills of those staff she had previously trained on site.
I feel this is a very human response to what Mrs. Scurr would go through in the immediate aftermath of something terrible. You know, your brain begins to ruminate, and you literally cannot stop thinking about it. So, in the process of that, you're going to fixate on any notable events in the past leading up to the massacre. But this is simply the hindsight bias at play. As human beings, we tend to assume that after something bad happens, that there were purposeful and obvious tells. This is because our brains like to think that events are not entirely random. Here, you can use Scurr's same line of logic, that being that 3 bad events happened before the massacre, and you could use it to argue that the same things were caused by ghosts. The series of events would not have been notable if they had not occurred in a similar time period to the massacre. They were only made notable by someone who was desperate to make sense out of an awful state of affairs. On the 28th of April, 1996, just after 1 PM, Scurr finished her tour guide shift. She brought lunch in the Port Arthur Cafe, and she remarks about having seen a blonde-haired man sitting on the balcony.
Wendy believes that this man may have been the blonde-haired gunman.
Regardless of what Miss Scurr believes she saw, there is a possibility that she actually just saw a different blonde-haired man sitting on the Port Arthur balcony. Scurr doesn't mention whether the gunman's clothes were the same or not, nor does she mention if he was carrying the infamous sports bag. We also know that Scurr was in the cafe from about 1 to 1:15 PM, and we know that Blondie didn't arrive there until 1:20 PM. Scurr then moved to the nearby information centre. She believes that at 1:28 PM the first shots began to fire.
Believing, like many others, that it was gas bottles exploding, Wendy ran out towards the cafe and was about 12 paces away from the side door when a piece of metal, she's still not sure if it was a bullet or shrapnel, whizzed past her shoulder. At about the same time, a person, she can't remember if it was a man or a woman, came tearing out of the cafe screaming that someone was shooting everyone inside and to run.
That person was Bridget Cook, who saved the lives of dozens of people. Inspired by this, Scurr ran towards another group outside the information centre and told them to run for cover. Scurr then ran back into the information centre to call police, where 2 of her colleagues, Sue Burgess and Steve Howard, had already been making themselves busy calling around the historic site phones to warn staff. Scurr called police at 1:32 PM, and somewhat understandably, the 000 operator didn't know what to make of the situation.
I took the receiver and put it out the door and let him hear the shots that were still going on. I went back in and said, "Do you believe me now?" And he said, "Look, I need your contact number." And I said, "Don't ring me, I won't be here. I've got to go. Please believe me, there are people here getting murdered."
Scurr, Burgess, and Howard believed that they would become trapped in the information centre if the gunman arrived. Scurr made the quick decision to run into the fixed scrub up behind the Port Arthur Cafe. In a moment of panic, Burgess grabbed a handheld radio and also didn't want to leave the cash register behind. Scurr humorously recalls yelling "fuck the till" as she ran out the door. They hid for several minutes in the bushes behind the Port Arthur Cafe. It was then that Ian Kingston radioed to say the gunman was still at large.
We heard on the radio that he'd left his car, that he was on foot, and that was the most frightening time of all, not knowing whether that man was going to come back in there on foot. We were so vulnerable, we felt like rabbits at a hunt.
Scurr attempted to comfort everyone, all the while beginning to brace herself to enter the cafe and administer first aid.
Her anticipation of the bloodshed within was compounded by a simple question from Sue. "I wonder if the girls got out." "What girls?" Wendy asked. Sue explained that teenage daughter Nicole and Stephen's wife Elizabeth were rostered on that day in the souvenir shop. Wendy suddenly realised that people she knew, friends, colleagues, could be among the dead and injured inside. I was all braced up for a terrible sight because I knew what was going to be in there, but that news about the girls came as a terrible shock because I didn't even know they were working that day, and to think of them in there, it was a terrible, terrible shock. The three pushed open the cafe door and entered a scene that Wendy can only describe as a butcher shop. Pools of blood lay thick on the floor and human remains were splattered around the walls and ceiling.
After Port Arthur doesn't go into detail about the emergency first aid Burgess, Howard, Scurr did when they were joined by Kingston, but the devastation was absolutely horrific. Scurr's speech at interval goes into explicit and quite graphic detail about the horror she saw. Now, I'm not planning on going into unnecessary detail, but be forewarned, viewer discretion from this point out is advised, especially when it comes to injury detail. I'm talking about this because in the middle of her speech, Scurr would often state something that she saw as strange, and then move on.
The staff was sent away to the East Coast, the management, at 11 o'clock that morning to stay overnight. And my supervisor, Robin Cooper, said that had never happened in the 18 years that she worked at Port Arthur, but they left at 11 o'clock and they were staying overnight. When they got word, they came back very quickly. They were back before the police came, but anyway, the CEO, he was wrapped. He said, we're going to get some SOGs in soon, and they're coming in by helicopter.
So as an audience member, we are supposed to fill in these gaps with belief of conspiracy, because that's how Scurr sees it. However, in my research, I came across enough information to fill in these gaps for us. So for example, Scurr describes the injury of one man who had pellet-like fragments around the gunshot wound. Scurr leaves it implied that someone shot this man with a shotgun. We are supposed to infer that the government isn't telling the entire truth. However, this is quite easily explained. To quote Hazelwood,
in fact, treating ambulance personnel were convinced for some time that Blondie had been using a shotgun in the cafe, due to the significant number of peppering wounds they noted. This turned out to be bony fragments from other victims. When someone is shot with a high-velocity weapon such as an AR-15, the speed at which bullets violate the body causes flesh and bone to leave the body at an unbelievably fast rate. The people with these peppering wounds were likely close to other victims, and their wounds were created from other victims' bones. Now, Blondie did bring a shotgun to Port Arthur, but, as we know, he never ended up using it. He would leave it in his Volvo before hijacking the car at the toll booth. Since we know for a fact he didn't use his shotgun, this evidence succinctly explains what Scurr saw.
While Scurr was looking for survivors, namely Burgess and Howard's relatives, who were inside the cafe,
and both these girls were lying behind the counter of the gift shop, and both were dead. I thought, how am I going to cope for this? So, I knew as soon as I looked at them they were gone, because there was a huge blood loss. And so I put on an act and I got down and made out I was feeling for their pulses, because they were saying, can you do anything? And I just didn't know what to say. I knew they was dead, and I just didn't know what to say. I just said, they're both dead. I'm so sorry.
She entered the gift shop and came across several bodies next to a staff entry door and a postcard stand. Scurr believed that there was a man underneath the freed deceased persons who was groaning in pain. Scurr tried to move the free persons when a frightening, bone-numbing flash went down her spine. It was in that moment that Scurr realised that the staff entry door had not been working, and these persons had been trapped and then shot whilst trying to escape. In a terrifying moment, Scurr believed that the gunman would come back and find her, when then she would be shot and trapped also.
I went into a blind panic and left. I felt terror, absolute terror. Wendy would spend months trying to reconcile her guilt over leaving a man who may have been alive in order to preserve herself. A mental burden which was eased only slightly after it was later revealed all of those killed in the cafe died instantly.
And I don't know, to this day, whether he was still alive. But I have been assured by the doctors that everybody died instantly. But I think they might just be saying that.
The man who she believed was alive and groaning was more than likely releasing post-mortem gases, which is where the muscles in your body begin to relax and you exasperate air. This is air from your lungs, air from your stomach. The door malfunction is one of the biggest points for Port Arthur Truth. Port Arthur Truthers believe that the staff entry door was locked intentionally. If it was locked intentionally, then it must be proof of a false flag attack. and there are several different leaps of logic that you'd have to make to draw this conclusion. My first argument is that even if the door was locked on purpose, that does not indicate that a conspiracy took place, right? So for example, survivor Caroline Lawton claims that...
So, he goes up to the other end of the cafe and he's shooting people hiding behind the counters, and people ran towards the green exit door. And earlier, they decided to lock the door because the public was stealing postcards off the postcard rack. And they were piled up because they couldn't get out, and he shot them dead.
This is one of the most recent interviews I could find, assumably in 2019. Now, I haven't read about this anywhere else, and I'm unsure exactly where Miss Lawton got this information from, so I'm not saying that this is definitively verified information, but it would explain the historic site's hesitance to explain what exactly went wrong with the door. Carol Altman did some original research and came across Commissioner Max Doyle's 1997 independent report. This is a document that Port Arthur Truth seems to think doesn't exist. Pats don't believe that any such investigation ever took place. So, when I read about it in her book, I went to the State Library of Tasmania to verify Altman's assertions. And guess what? They let me photocopy the whole thing.
In moments like this, I am reminded of John Ronson's book, Them, Adventures with Extremists, where Ronson humorously points out that conspiracy theorists and extremists rarely actually ask if they can actually view supposed secret information. So, I have this in digital form, and I can confirm to you that Altman's quotes are correct.
Doyle harshly criticised the historic site management for the handling of the massacre, and in particular with this door. Now initially, the historic site staff tried to brush off the story, claiming that speculating on particular what-ifs would inhibit healing. Doyle reports that it was Damien Bugg, the prosecutor for the Crown himself, who uncovered what happened with the door.
Bugg confirmed that the door was not working that day and that the site authority had been made aware that it was not functioning about 2 weeks before the shootings. A request to have it repaired, however, appeared to have been made only verbally and not in writing. There was, Bugg found, no sense of urgency about having it repaired because it was used rarely by the staff and not at all by the public. Nobody, of course, could have foreseen how important the door would become.
Now, in my opinion, there was an attempted cover-up here by the historic site management. Well, it was less of an explicit cover-up, but more of a lazy sweeping under of the rug. The historic site failed to fix a door that had previously been complained about. Since the door wasn't an emergency exit, the historic site management thought that it wasn't urgent to be fixed. So, after the massacre happened, they realised that they, the management themselves, could potentially be liable for the 8 murders that occurred in the gift shop. So, when the staff brought it up, the management tried to dismiss it as,
"Oh man, don't worry about it. We don't need to look into that. We need to focus on our own healing."
A board chairman and general management of the historic site both resigned after this report, because it exposed their own incompetence and lack of empathy for their own surviving staff. At no point does Doyle come across anything resembling a conspiracy. There wasn't even a conspiracy to cover up the door, it was just lazy dismissal. But this door sticks within the mind's eye, and the conspiracy theorists can't let go of it, because it was the wrong thing happening at the wrong time. Scurr, who was in court when Bugg revealed this information about the door, however intentionally, chose to dismiss this information because it wasn't enough to quell the pain that was festering inside of her. This is what is referred to as the big cause fallacy. This is when we assume that a big event must have a big cause, when in reality, causes are often banal and meaningless. To the conspiracy theorist, the door being locked has to be part of an NWO false flag attack. But as we know, the lock mechanism simply did not work, and the historic site management had not gotten around to fixing it yet.
I feel like it would make more sense if the door was locked intentionally, right? Because that would give us a little bit of meaning for why something horrible happened. But it's simply a tragedy. It's random, it's chaos, and that's how it happened. It's nothing more than an extremely unfortunate coincidence. And there's always a temptation to blame someone for this randomness, and I certainly think that the historic site management should have bared some of the responsibility. But what are we to do? This is the vulgarity of randomness, and it's a tough pill to swallow. It's at this point that Scurr composes herself, and directly after experiencing the most terrifying moment of her entire life, she continues to heal the wounded. Scurr puts her first aid training to use and assigns Howard on blanket collecting duties. She then sends Burgess to assist Kingston, who is taking command on site. Scurr then went back into the cafe once again to see if anyone could still be saved. As we explained in the last chapter, since the management was away at a conference in Swansea, it was up to senior staff to care for the 600-some people on site. And words cannot describe the heroism that the staff displayed. I'm not a good writer, I cannot do it justice, but I think Doyle begins to convey it.
It is perhaps impossible for, other than those 31 people, plus the visitors present, to fully understand the amazement of the happening and the fright, hopelessness, bravery, heroism, stress, trauma, and the wonderful acts of thinking of others, of planning, of sharing, and of loss and sadness that all took place in the space of that first 30 to 60 minutes of the shootings.
It was after this short period that ambulances began to arrive. First came the local ambulance, the Irelands, and half an hour later, ambulances from Hobart arrived. Scurr was incredibly upset that police had not arrived by 3:30, and she was enraged that an individual officer arrived on site at 4:30 PM, and he wasn't armed. But as we have previously discussed in Chapter 2, the police were urged by Ian Kingston to capture Blondie. Now, this information was not spread across the entire site, and Scurr did not know that this was the case, and this is upsetting.
We have to acknowledge here that a lot of Scurr's trauma came from this fear of whether or not the gunman was going to come back. And right now I'd like to make a distinction between rational fear and a kind of emotional fear. Imagine yourself from Scurr's perspective, and it's been years since the massacre. You somewhat rationally understand that there was a reason for why no police officers were on site for those first few hours. You understand that because you've probably heard it from people. But then your gut, your emotional fear, overwhelms you because you remember how it felt to be there in that moment. Your rational reasons are not enough to satisfy your emotions, to stop the pain in your gut. So even years after the fact of knowing why the police took so long to arrive, I can genuinely have empathy for Scurr for still feeling that fear. I do not want to dismiss it, because Scurr's pain was not hypothetical, it was real.
Around 6 PM, Scurr was directed to the Kahlua Motel, which was adjacent to the historic site. This was a place filled with grief-stricken survivors. Scurr had to continue to suppress her own emotions as she was the lone figure of authority here.
The CEO approached me about 6 o'clock. I had to go to the hotel because there was a lot of people up there and they're starting to get sick. But the first thing I found was a young man up there with a bullet grazed atop the cross of his head. He was the fiancé of the girl who'd lost a skull. He was sitting in a chair swaying. I asked why he had not accompanied the walking wounded on a coach to Hobart. He said his fiancée was dead in the cafe and he still had not had the courage to ring her parents in Western Australia. He said he didn't know how he could do it. I was thinking those police should be doing this. I had to find a room for him. He was put on the bed and was accompanied by friends with whom they had seen travelling.
As dusk fell, the ongoing nightmare shifted again as shots were heard close to Kahlua, sparking fear among the grieving friends and relatives sheltering in the cottage that gunmen had returned. Like those in Kahlua, the people gathered in the motel were told to close the curtains, shut off the lights, and keep quiet. But Wendy recalls she refused to plunge the frightened, traumatised people into darkness. If I had turned the lights out on those people, they would have been blown out of their brains, so I made an executive decision to leave them on. I was panicking, but I had been panicking all day. I was calm on the outside, but inside I was just shot to pieces.
We don't know who fired these shots. We don't know why. We saw a news broadcast on television at the hotel. They said the gunman was surrounded at Seascape, so who was it? Had he escaped, or was it someone else?
This is another case of thing odd, therefore conspiracy. It is certainly odd that someone shot off 3 bullets during this time, but according to the testimony of Dr. Pam Fentry,
everyone was in a state of heightened alert, and we only found out much later that it was somebody shooting rabbits.
That was it. It was just some oblivious old codger who was just shooting rabbits. What a dickhead. By 7 PM, police had arrived in force and statements were given. Scurr found this whole process humiliating. All she wanted to do was to go home. Scurr finally got back to her husband at 1 AM and she wept. Scurr couldn't sleep, and she spent the night with a gun resting against her lap, in case the gunman came in to get her. This was Scurr's experience on the day. Few of us will ever experience something so horrifying, and I must reiterate one more time that I feel a lot of respect and sympathy for this woman. As the years went on, Scurr became increasingly frustrated that her colleagues' efforts were not recognised for what they were. In fact, Scurr herself was not entitled to victims' compensation. The strict and bureaucratic rules of the Victims' Appeal Fund only covered people who were physically harmed by the gunman, or it assisted with funeral costs and travel costs for the trial. Each victim was expected to receive between $10,000 to $20,000 each. However, since Scurr was not technically physically injured at the site, she was not entitled to receive the VFA. This is bureaucratic bullshit, and I truly have nothing but contempt for this individual case. Until her dying day, Scurr was furious about this, and she had to endure several mental health breakdowns, trips to the psychiatric ward at the Royal Hobart Hospital, expensive counselling and medication costs, and that's not to mention all the mental health pain that she was going through. Scurr was diagnosed with severe PTSD, and the appeal fund really could have helped her monetarily. Wendy Scurr tried to link this to some kind of conspiracy made up against her specifically. And I'm going to word this next sentence very carefully. I sincerely believe that this is false. Scurr needed some kind of narrative to understand what had just happened to her. Altman described her as obsessively seeking some kind of nebulous truth, as if finding it would relieve Scurr of some of the immense pain that she felt in her body. And while I have serious empathy for her, there is not a single conspiracy against Scurr. Survivor Caroline Lawton lost her daughter and she was shot in the Broad Arrow Cafe.
I wish it had been me instead of her. Deep down, I felt I had failed her at the one vital point in her life. I had failed her. I hadn't saved her.
Lawton received $20,000 in compensation. As we can see, she was most certainly affected and entitled to the money.
The whole area has been rebuilt from bones that have been found from the rest of my body, skin graft off my leg, and I've had major veins taken out of my neck to revascularise my back to keep it alive.
But at a conference in 1997, Lawton exploded.
$20,000 criminal compensation. That's it. That's what a life is worth. It's a national disgrace.
Have you written to the Prime Minister?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And the trouble is that we are so distraught, we are so broken, are having so much therapy. If you like, I will take my top off and I will show you the wound that I have in my left shoulder as a result of what happened at Port Arthur, lying across my daughter's body. And I am furious. The victims, the real victims, were the 35 people, and they have to be looked after first, and their families.
Peter Hazelwood said of this encounter,
Carol made her statements and the packed media room listened politely, almost timidly. She was very emotional, but very powerful in a way she made her point. She then thanked the media for listening and left. I met her as she left the side entrance of the town hall, and she grabbed my arm and said,
"How did I go?"
I said, "Well, thank heaven you left the state government out of it. I thought we were in for a bashing there for a bit, and was only going to stop you if you started to take your clothes off." She laughed and said thanks for that.
"Do you know where I work? I'm a Commonwealth public servant,"
she said and laughed again. But this time, compared to a few hours ago, she sounded happy. I thought, and indeed hoped, that in some way she had lifted a huge emotional burden from herself this afternoon.
The money was not the problem, and I think Scurr on some level must have known that. I think she just wanted someone to come in and clearly relieve her of her guilt and PTSD, and it's extremely unfortunate that the human brain doesn't work like that. I believe Scurr's case here is one of the most important reasons why we ought to remember the Port Arthur Massacre. Lawton and Scurr, along with the hundreds of those directly affected, dealt with the physical injuries of firearms, but they didn't hurt anywhere near as much as the grief did.
The last thing that I'd like to say is that it has been reported that a lot of us have psychiatric conditions. We have indeed. I still see a psychiatrist. I've been in hospital many times in an effort to beat my depression. I've also had shock treatment. I even tried to commit suicide to find peace. This was about 14 months ago. In this, I'm not alone. We are not paranoid, and I've told you this because I think the powers that be will attack my mental state. I'm not mad, I'm just sad.
Scurr had this nasty compulsion to pick at this conspiracy theory. It was like a festering wound that she couldn't stop picking at, and I don't blame her for it. If there is one thing I could partly blame her for, though, it would be her part of the dissemination of the illegal police tape. This is by far and away the most controversial, I don't want to say a piece of evidence. There is a videotape that features graphic footage of the 35 people who were murdered at Port Arthur. Now, full disclaimer, this footage is highly illegal, and I will not be showing it here. Even if it wasn't highly illegal, I wouldn't be showing it here because it features dead children. I bring it up for two reasons. Firstly, I think how this footage became public is an interesting story by itself.
It is unclear exactly how Scurr first came across this tape. The first time I heard about this story, I heard someone claim that the tape was given to Scurr while she was giving a tour at Port Arthur. But I can't source that claim, so I rely upon Altman's testimony, which is yet more mysterious. I believe it is worth quoting her at length here.
2 weeks earlier, I had emailed Wendy, who agreed to be part of this book, to ask if I could visit and take her photograph. She was pleased I had made contact, she said, as something big had happened, and it changes everything. It was too sensitive to discuss via email or telephone, she said, so she would wait until my visit to tell me the full details of this huge thing. Knowing Wendy's obsessive belief that the Port Arthur Massacre was a government-sanctioned terrorist attack, I was sceptical about what this huge thing might be. It was, I thought, most likely another piece of evidence that Wendy had unearthed to support the terrorist theories. On the agreed day of our meeting, we wandered over to a nearby park to take photographs, and as we crunched our way back along the gravel footpath, Wendy revealed the story of the video. She had a friend, she explained, who bought used videos from Tasmanian tip shops to use for recording. They were cheap, maybe 10 or 20 cents each. As Wendy explained it, among the videos her friend had bought from a Hobart tip shop for 10 cents was a police training video based around the Port Arthur Massacre. It showed the gruesome aftermath of the massacre inside the Broad Arrow Cafe and beyond, she said. I swallowed. If this was true, then this was a huge news story about a major security breach within Tasmania Police. There were few issues, if any, more sensitive in Tasmania than the Port Arthur Massacre.
It turns out she was right. This was a major security breach at Tas Police, and according to this Sydney Morning Herald article,
Tasmania Police Deputy Commissioner Jack Johnston responded to media reports that the highly sensitive police tape depicting the massacre scene had been sold in a Hobart tip shop for 10 cents. The 22-minute tape, marked as training footage for police use only, includes about 12 minutes of graphic scenes after the massacre, including images of bodies as they were found.
Tasmanian police are trying to have graphic images of the 1996 Port Arthur Massacre removed from the internet.
Those that are here now, that were here on that 15 years ago, it's going to affect them. It's going to open old wounds. It's going to make them think again, we put it in the past, we were moving on.
It is unfortunate that this tape was subject to the Streisand effect. My second point is that this is an explicit piece of evidence against the existence of a conspiracy. Right? We have an example of a security breach at Tas Police, and the tape itself makes no mention of a conspiracy. Now, there are several versions of the tape, as Altman notes, but none of them say,
"Oh, gee whiz, us at Tas Police sure did a great job covering up this massacre, Mr. Howard. Oh, by the way, how do I get your bank details?"
There's nothing like that. But I digress. Scurr gave a copy of this file to a close friend of hers, who was later identified as Miss Scully. She later was found to have a large role in disseminating the video on the internet, who used this file as some kind of Jewish Howard conspiracy on the part of the government. And according to Altman,
Wendy Scurr acknowledges some people have used Port Arthur as part of an anti-Semitic agenda, which she says she finds abhorrent and of which she wants no part. Wendy cut all ties with Scully, she says, after the release of the police video became caught up in Scully's anti-Semitic views.
I find it interesting, then, that Scurr consistently aligned herself with people and factions who express xenophobic and racist sentiments. Scurr seemed to have felt no one else would have listened to her. She passed away in 2018, and these factions continued to use her life as a clickbait point. They used her death to spread fake news about the Port Arthur Massacre. Conspiracy theorists took advantage of a devastated and fragile woman to make themselves feel more validated, and I think it is disgusting, and it should be a point of shame within the community. A decade after the publishing of After Port Arthur, journalist Sonia Vomard asked Altman what her opinion of Scurr was.
She's a very interesting person. Her journey's been a very difficult one. It's as though events like the Port Arthur Massacre are so inexplicable. Some people cope by making up theories in their own heads about what happened. Because of the enormity of it, it becomes important to create this framework around it that is separate to the individual. Becoming known for this conspiracy theory stuff took on a life of its own for Wendy. She was the expert. She went on all the shows. There was obsessive research around it. It became almost a career for her.
At different times, she thought there was only one gunman, and at others, multiple gunmen. And I think that is because of this community that she found herself in. If we go back to the Interval Forum, there is this infuriating attitude the audience has. Scurr describes some of the most horrifying shit I've ever heard in my entire life, and the conspiracy theorists completely disregard her testimony and emotions to ask her if there were multiple gunmen or not.
Did you give any report of during the shooting, did you see the person shooting?
I didn't see the person shooting at all. Well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Andrew might be able to later.
I take it that you were not interviewed by the police about this massacre. Have you got any idea why?
I was interviewed by the police, but as soon as I got to the Broad Arrow part of it, I didn't want to know any more.
Yes, you earlier said that there were 500 people in the cafe at the time of the shooting.
No, I didn't say that. There were 500 people at Port Arthur.
Oh, at Port Arthur. Were all the people in the cafe killed?
No. There were supposedly, according to the court, there were 20 killed, 12 injured, with 29 bullets.
And I think this is the heart of this conspiracy theory. They do not care about victims, compensation, or their well-being. The theorist used the victim as an actor, playing out a role and lacking a third dimension. Scurr wasn't a real person to these theorists, but simply a point of validation. They did not care for her, and anyone telling you anything else to the contrary are simply lying to you and to themselves. To prove my case further, Scurr strongly disagreed with the boldest claim of Port Arthur truth, which is merely another nail in the coffin for them. This one claim is big enough to warrant its entire own chapter. The most common accusation that Port Arthur truth makes relates to the first confrontation in the Broad Arrow Cafe. They say that every single person who was killed there was shot in the head while the gun was aimed from the gunman's right hip. And that certainly sounds questionable upon first impression, and I know from personal experience, this is the one niggle in the back of your mind that you struggle to rationalize the most. As Pat say, only the most skilled gunman could have shot 22 people from the hip with nothing but headshots. Now, since this is the most significant point of contention, we must analyze where it comes from. This argument dates its way back to conspiracy theorist Joe Viles. Now, it is generally frowned upon to make ad hominem attacks against the person making a claim, attacking a person's character and not engaging with the goddamn argument, but in my eyes, it would be intellectually dishonest and quite irresponsible of me to not talk about the man who sourced these claims. To give you a taste of old mate Joe, he's already spoken a lot about 9/11 trutherism because, of course he has. I do think that his position is kind of funny. He believes that there were no hijackers on board of any of the aircrafts. Instead, he says,
4 aircraft used in the attacks were hijacked electronically from the ground.
Hike the planet! Hike the planet!
Shut up and get in the car!
Hike the planet!
which I sincerely hope I don't have to debunk for you. Joe seems to live in another dimension, and no respectable source would ever cite him. He published the seminal Port Arthur Truther book, Deadly Deception at Port Arthur. Now, to be transparent, I did not buy this book. There exists a PDF online which you can browse for yourself. I urge you not to give his estate money. It profits off of other people's misery, with his, in my opinion, baseless claims. This book is a foundational text of the movement, and I cannot express enough how much influence it has. To just give you a brief taster, when Pauline Hanson was caught on camera espousing doubt about the massacre,
an MP said it would actually take a massacre in Tasmania to change the government.
Wow. No, it's that whole Super 11 thing too.
Those shots, they were precision shots to the around. I've read a lot and I've read the book on it, Port Arthur.
Yeah.
Questions there.
Bolt asked why she told Roger Muller about precision shots and how there were lots of questions concerning the mass shooting. Precision shots? Bolt declared. There were no precision shots. Blondie walked up to the people lying there and shot them in the head. That's not a precision shot. There was a couple of photos in the book of him holding the gun, Hanson answered, looking shaken. He wasn't up close to all these people. There was a brief pause in which Bolt seemed to be struggling to process what Hanson had just said.
The book I take it you're referring to is the Port Arthur Massacre Conspiracy by Joe Viles, or however you pronounce his name, who indeed talks about precision shot. That's the one?
I can't. It was a blue book.
Now this
book... It was a blue book. It wasn't real thick.
Predictably, Bolt did later claim that he was a little bit more sympathetic to Hanson than the initial clip and interview would imply, but she still took all of this information from that dastardly little blue book. Peter Charlie then goes on to say,
I'd heard of Vile's conspiracy theory. I'd written the theory off as utter nonsense.
When we examine other sources, in the Facebook groups, Deadly Deception is shared every other week, and content creators constantly preach about how great this book is. So, this is essential reading, and I'm going to quickly demonstrate to you what is wrong with just the back text of this book.
In less than 20 minutes, at this and 5 other crime scenes, the marksman killed 35, injured 22, and crippled 2 cars with only 64 shots. 19 of the first 20 dead in the Broad Arrow Cafe died from single shots to the head.
Within 2 sentences, we already have so many false claims. He sets out to evoke confusion in how one could harm 57 people and 2 cars with only 64 shots. He ignores that many of the wounded were hit with shrapnel, and that bullets that come from an AR-15 can shoot through several human bodies at once. When we consider that, along with the incredibly confined space this part of the massacre took place in, this makes sense.
All fired from the unknown marksman, from his right hip. This staggering display of marksmanship was blamed on the left-handed, intellectually impaired Blondie, who had no shooting experience or military training of any kind.
Someone who has even casually glanced at the facts would understand this is all wrong. He clearly didn't do any research. It would be willful ignorance to act as if Joe is reporting in good faith here. He already had a conclusion, and he molds any kind of evidence he finds to mold around it. He uses language like roughly and about to describe precise evidence. This is because when people criticize him for being off in his math, he has just that little bit of wiggle room to correct himself. He points to such concrete evidence as him thinking that the gunshots were actually shot outside of the cafe, and how he reckons the clouds look different from the authentic tourist footage. He alleges with no evidence that some of the tourist footage shot on site was faked. It's important to note here that Joe Viles is the originator of the Israeli super soldier theory. Joe has written 3 books, and each single one he claims that a Mossad Israeli counter-terrorist operator was responsible for each of the 3 crimes. Each book has the same conclusion. Israel did it. I wonder why, that's so specific. He also believes that the Mossad operators caused the 2004 Indonesian earthquakes and floods, a natural disaster, mind you, that killed over 200,000 people. He believes it was staged in collaboration with the CIA. This is nonsense, and I would call it pointless speculation, but his point is to spread his extremely biased anti-Semitic agenda. Now, to quote the man himself writing on the BibleBelievers.org.au, a very trustworthy source, In his opinion, a private investigator should
avoid eyewitness accounts and media hype like the Black Plague. Eyewitnesses do not lie intentionally, but as any honest psychologist will tell you, the accuracy of their testimony is limited by many factors including stress, suggestive police interrogators, and peer pressure.
Funnily enough, much of this book relies upon the testimony of Wendy Scurr. Keep in mind, she was not inside the cafe during the shooting. She was a person who identified a blonde-haired man as the shooter, and not a man in a blonde wig, who then read this book, and in her own words...
Do you agree with the book, in principle, the book Deadly Deception at Port Arthur? Have you read the book?
I have got an article in it, but it's there's a lot I don't agree with.
Okay, thank you.
You'll also be surprised to know that he has no credentials in ballistics nor forensics. He then goes on to claim that Blondie was kept in
strict solitary confinement and denied access to media of any kind until his police interrogation on the 4th of July 1996.
Which is quite easily explained. As we've already discussed, he wasn't allowed access to media because he was on trial. He craved attention, wanted infamy, and the state denied him that. Joe here is flip-flopping on whether or not the media is in on it. Joe simultaneously claims if Blondie was allowed to speak to the media, he would be exonerated. Then claims the media had the picture for the front page ready months in advance. Also, other prisoners wanted to kill him. If he was going to get to trial, he'd have to be alive. And speaking of that, he attempted suicide multiple times and was placed in a special suicide prevention cell to prevent him from getting out of punishment. There is plenty of reason why he was in quote-unquote solitary confinement, which he wasn't. He was still in the hospital. Joe is using this to manipulate the audience into believing the only reason Blondie confessed was because he didn't want to be in solitary anymore. There are perfectly understandable reasons why they wanted him to face trial, why they wanted to keep him alive for said trial, and the methods they used on a perpetrator with extenuating circumstances were completely justifiable.
What an absolute farce. This man is not credible. He's a crackpot who mainly wrote about how Jews are secretly controlling the world. So, when this man claims that he reckons that some of the shots were fired from the hip, he's manufacturing utter bullshit. I mean, rare is there another example of a person acting in more bad faith. This is where Port Arthur Truth gets this idea from. A man with the intellectual integrity and honesty of a rubbish bin. Actually, a rubbish bin is useful for something. Joe Viles is directly responsible for much of the anti-Semitism lingering under the surface of the Port Arthur Truth movement. Joe died in 2005 after succumbing to a heart attack. I bet you anything that a Mossad operator actually induced the heart attack because Joe was getting too close to the truth of the Israelis actually being responsible for the death of Princess Diana. Oh, and Prince Harry wearing a swastika that one time. He thinks they did it, and that's not a joke. With all of that in mind, now let's actually engage with the argument. The argument here is that Blondie shot everyone in the Broad Arrow Cafe in under 2 minutes, shooting with his left hand, which was his non-dominant hand. From his right hip, he got exclusively headshots, and killing those inside the cafe was just from that. Now, Joe does concede that a few people might have been killed by other means, but it sure would be a right shame for his argument if a whole collective of eyewitnesses could dispute what he asserts. Oh god, I wonder if that's the case. Let's do just a little bit of research. To engage in this argument in good faith, we are going to describe scenes of extreme violence. I do not do this to glorify the events or the shooter, nor to take advantage of the victims, but because it is extremely important to understand why Viles' argument is fake. I do this in respect of the victims. Joe Viles is correct. The first 2 people shot in the Broad Arrow Cafe were shot from the hip. According to a story in Strength by Margaret Scott, survivor Mick Sargent describes the first 2 murders of Malaysian tourists, Mo Yi Ning and Su Le Chung. He describes looking back suddenly after the first bang, observing how the second shot was fired Rambo style. Then he recalls a moment a split second later when Blondie raised the rifle up to his shoulder and aimed the gun at him. Quite harrowing to think about, but here, person number 3 who was shot was Mick Sargent. The shot grazed his skull. He's incredibly lucky to be alive. And unfortunately, his girlfriend was not so lucky. Blondie then spun around and murdered Anthony Nightingale. His last words were, "No, no, not here." These 5 people were killed within 5 seconds. It was so quick that no one could act. The Broad Arrow Cafe was a very small place. These first 5 dead were within a few meters of each other. When Blondie re-entered the cafe, he put his bag down on a table that was next to the Malaysian couple, and just ahead of Sargent's table. Before they were shot, Kate Scott remarked to Sargent that the man with the bag was a real glutton for punishment, because his bag looked so big and heavy. He would shoot her in the back of the head seconds later. Mr. Ning died instantly and was still holding his dinner knife in his hand. According to the Crown,
examination of his body disclosed that the muzzle of the firearm was close to him when fired because there was a gunpowder stippling around the entrance wound.
Many of the injuries were due to shrapnel. According to the Crown,
that observation is a process used by ballistic experts to try and determine the distance between the muzzle of the firearm and the object or body which the firearm had been fired at. The range used by Bryant to cause the injuries and murder people in the cafe was in most cases at very close quarters, and the terms used by the ballistics expert to examine the injuries of the persons who sustained injury and the bodies of the deceased gave 3 ranges of shots: close or contact, being either contact or within a few centimeters of the body; intermediate, being within a few centimeters out to about 1 to 1.5 meters; and then distant, being 1 to 1.5 meters and beyond. Certainly, within the intermediate range and in the close or contact range, there is, with a firearm such as the one used by Bryant on this day, a residue of unburnt propellant which is discharged from the muzzle of the gun, which causes a stippling or tattooing effect around the entry wound.
We can see from the first 5 people, 2 of them were shot from the hip in the head, which is correct, and the other 3 were shot from the shoulder. This is going to start a trend. Blondie alternated between firing from the shoulder, looking down the sights of his AR-15, and hip firing. Now you still might say, okay, yes, maybe the first few of these were shot from the shoulder. The conspiracy theorists will then allege, well, the rest of them were shot from the hip and from far away. It's at this point where I must give you a very quick visual demonstration, right? Imagine this is the shooter, and imagine all of these are the people, right? Imagine this. And conspiracy theorists allege that Blondie stood still, bang, 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 bang. He aimed people while he was standing still. That's the way that this argument works. But what they don't seem to recognize is that Blondie had legs. Bang, 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 bang. Now, the case that the Crown brought forth was made after police reconstructing the events for 2 months to figure out precisely what it was that happened in the building.
There were 5 spent shells located near the bag, all fired from the AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, which was later recovered from Seascape and admitted by Bryant in an interview with the police as belonging to him.
Which gun did you have?
I had the,
Mr. Warren, hold it.
AR-15.
This was the weapon that was used in the cafe where 20 people died. This particular gun fires a bullet at around about 3,200 feet per second.
See, if people didn't do these unfortunate things, you guys wouldn't have a job.
Well, there's a lot of truth in that, man, let me tell you.
That one there?
Yes.
Yeah. That was the one.
This is the one.
It's a sweet little gun.
We know that the gun that Blondie admitted to owning was firing shots at Seascape and Broad Arrow. There were no spent shells inside Broad Arrow that were from any other weapon. I need to take another moment to pause here, because we have to discuss how Pats view this document. Now, they do not deny that the Crown presented this, but they view it as completely illegitimate. As we discussed in part 2 of this series, Pats are systemically suspicious of the government and courts on principle. So, I am aware that this evidence is never going to convince the individual committed theorist, which makes it all the more infuriating that they do not have any counter-evidence, nor a counter-timeline. As we have also discussed in part 2 of this series, bare assertion is their evidence, and they have not needed any kind of timeline yet because there is no utility in such a thing. They claim that the Crown cited no forensic evidence in the case against Blondie, yet I've just read out 3 different counts of forensic evidence being cited. The most that you can get out of the truther is selective quoting, casting doubt upon the official narrative. On principle, the shells from the AR-15 either do not exist or were planted. Yet at the same time, Blondie's testimony, which is shown in the court transcript, is simultaneously exonerating and faked. They will pick and choose at individual quotes, claiming that he was a roaring beach, for example, to prove innocence. They will then claim that the rest of this document is false. In writing this paragraph, I am talking circles around the point to convey my understanding of the conspiracist mindset, but as I have shown from the first 5 shots alone, talking around the point is a waste of time, because the truth is simpler, blunter, and more convincing than anything that Port Arthur Truth can demonstrate. So what happened next in the cafe? After shooting Nightingale, Blondie shoots Ray Sharp in the side of the head at close range from the shoulder. Wally Bennett was shot with the muzzle pressed up against his neck. The bullet blasts through his neck and hits the arm of his friend Kevin Sharp. Sharp was shot a second time, close range. The second bullet explodes, fragments, and lodges itself in the face of Gary Broom, who was in a booth nearby. So far, the shots have all been close range, and have, so far, been made from the shoulder. I concede that it would be strange if someone were able to get all of these shots from their hip with their non-dominant hand from far away, but this set of circumstances is utterly misleading to what actually happened. In actual reality, he was walking table to table, shooting patrons. Furthermore, the assertion that Blondie fired exclusively from the hip is again obviously misleading. We know he alternated between shoulder and hip fire, with survivor and forensic evidence pointing to the preference of shoulder fire. Evidence from the coroner concludes that most of the dead had burn marks around their wounds. These burn marks can only happen at close range. This is because when a bullet is fired, gunpowder explodes and ignites. The fiery discharge is blown out through the barrel towards the target. If the target is at especially close range, they will be burnt by the discharge. Since the vast majority of the dead in the Broad Arrow Cafe had these burn marks, we can safely conclude that these gunshots were at extreme close range.
A lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
Blondie continued firing at patrons for approximately another 30 seconds, shooting at anyone on the ground in the cafe, shooting the injured, shooting confused patrons. Anybody in his way, he shot them. Young and old, he shot them. This is as good a time as any to reiterate that there were not multiple gunmen in the cafe. Nobody who was inside of the cafe has ever claimed that there were more than one gunman. By this point, Blondie had exited the cafe and walked into the adjoining gift shop.
Police are later able to establish the timing based on the videotapes taken by tourists from outside the cafe, some hundreds of metres away. One tape by a Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson of Victoria, who had filmed from behind the cafe towards the penitentiary ruins, stops after 15 seconds. By that time, Blondie has fired 17 times, the last at Robert Elliott. The second tape by Barry Turner was taken from the opposite direction and records 21 shots in 25 seconds, the last 4 inside the gift shop.
This would only be 1/3 of the murders inside the buildings. As we know, several people ran into the gift shop to escape the gunfire, finding the exit door of the gift shop to be locked. The 2 girls hid behind the counter. Blondie shot them at point-blank range. They dropped where they once hid. 3 other people were in the corner next to the door, and only 1 would survive.
Ron Neander, who had just retired from an undertaking business in Adelaide, was on holiday with his wife Gwen. He saw Mary Howard shot and described how he and Gwen ducked behind a postcard stand, which kept us out of his line of sight, but not for long. Once Nicole and Elizabeth had been killed, Gwen was the next one in line, so she got it. Gwen was hit in the face. I knew straight away she was dead. There was so much blood.
Blondie heard a brief rustling, and instead of shooting Mr. Needler, he turned around and re-entered the cafe and shot Peter Croswell and his 2 friends. Luckily, all 3 of them managed to survive. Ron and Peter both recognized Blondie as the man who was yelling about Japanese tourists outside before the shooting, and both of them made positive identifications to police. There was a brief pause in gunfire, and a father named Jason Winter mistook this as a sign that Blondie had left. He yelled out to his wife, son, and father-in-law that he's gone, only for Blondie to turn the corner and shoot him twice. The 2 bullets that killed him also broke off into shrapnel that hit Dennis Olsen. He was hit in the hand, chest, head, and eye. It is important to say that when we say this person was shot, he was not specifically shot at. There's a difference, I swear. He was injured by shrapnel and thus was shot. This is why the number sounds so high to us. The amount of damage an AR-15 can do is completely inconceivable to us. This only compounds the fact that all of these shots had been done at close range.
It was all over in 90 seconds. He murdered 20 people and a number of other people were seriously injured. He expended all the ammunition that was in the AR-15 semi-automatic military weapon that he had. They were full metal jacket rounds.
This bag of .308 cartridges was found also in the Volvo vehicle at the toll booth.
None of these shots require expert marksmanship, as a host of conspiracy theorists will naively claim later. They are fired from the hip, so close to the victims that little aim is required.
This is why hip headshots doesn't work. The phrase, the idea of this marksmanship, is in tension with the reality of what actually happened in the Broad Arrow Cafe and the gem cell. It does not matter whether he was using his left hand to pull the trigger or not, because the gun was up against his victims. It does not matter if he was shooting from the hip, because he walked from table to table shooting people at point-blank range. The last 5 people who were shot inside the building were all in one corner. The rear exit door was also locked. There is no cover and no way out. It's truly harrowing to conceive what happened next, but we must highlight the small moments of heroism. Many people were injured and died because they threw themselves in front of their loved ones. Many husbands dived in front of their wives' bodies, mothers over their children, and some of them saved their lives.
20 people lay dead and a dozen or more injured by the time Blondie stops firing. Not because the carnage is finished. He has to reload.
There was another man in that corner, and he survived to tell his tale.
An Asian tourist lived to tell how he confronted death. Bryant aimed the gun at him, pulled the trigger, but the magazine was empty.
Bodies lay scattered through the room. Survivors will later talk of the lack of noise during the ordeal, although the sound of gunfire, heavy and robotic, would have drowned the screams of those who were unable to stay silent as they hoped to be missed by the gunman in his methodical hunt. The wounds are horrific. The jigsaw of clues from witness accounts, video footage, sound bites and ballistic evidence estimate that Blondie was inside the cafe shooting for between 90 and 120 seconds. He murdered 20 people and injured 12 more, either from direct fire or shrapnel. In all, he would fire 29 times, almost all from point-blank range.
This is as good a time as any to point out that Joe Viles explicitly states that Blondie didn't know how to shoot a gun. I was going to do a comedic bit here, like imagine my head exploding or a big reverbed yell, but I won't, because it is simply too pathetic to even waste that much effort over. We already know that his father bought him his first air rifle when he was 14. We already know he'd been shooting since then. Now, conspiracy theorists will sometimes concede that this particular claim is wrong, but they will still argue for the hip headshots argument, arguing that it is sound. Paul Motor, in specific, says he denounces Joe Viles, but he still believes something was afoot inside of the cafe. Just think about this for a second. Viles' theory is predicated upon a man who has little to no experience with a firearm. If that falls apart, then the theory does too. There is no other way to view these murders that is not in good faith. Viles was arguing from a bad faith position. He wanted to blame Israel for everything that was wrong with the world, and he scraped together this book as a response, and it cannot be taken seriously. Most of the theories about the shootings do not include the bus park murders, and instead of running through all of those in sequential order, I report to you that they were mostly killed at point-blank range. When he killed Nanette Nikak and the girls, he killed them all at point-blank range. Viles created so much damage over a case he barely knew about. Viles also claimed to be at Port Arthur during the shooting. He never provides any evidence of this, so this is the main argument for Port Arthur truth. It is inaccurate, ignorant, and inconceivably awful. It is also incredibly unconvincing, and it spits in the face of all evidence and all testimony of everyone who was actually there on the day. This is nothing more than a farce. Before I reach my conclusion for this episode, I have some leftover questions for Port Arthur Truth. It's what I want them to consider. It's questions that may have never occurred to them, and I have not brought them up yet because I wanted to save it for now. Okay? Question 1. If the government was so all-powerful that they were able to commit this massacre without the public finding out, why did they forget to put handguns in the NFA? Why do you not think the Monash University shooting was a false flag attack? There were 2 answers to this question. The first being that you forgot about the Monash University shooting, and 2, the perpetrator in that case was Asian. Therefore, his criminality was more inherent in your worldview. Question 2. Why the hell would you attack survivors? Surely every person who was in the Port Arthur Cafe cannot have been a secret plant. Surely there would be at least a few innocent bystanders. Why do they speak out against your arguments? Why do you only give them hostility? Why do you believe they were crisis actors in Tasmania in 1996? Question 3. If Blondie was innocent, why the hell did he bring his gun collection with him to Port Arthur? He claims in the interview that he wanted to go shooting before surfing, and sure, maybe, but then why would he bring the shotgun, a weapon he was specifically afraid of? And then, if he was supposedly innocent, why would he steal a car, take a hostage, and then lay siege at Seascape for 18 hours? Question 4. Why do you have more faith in the government's ability to pull off a conspiracy theory than me? How can you honestly believe that an event of this magnitude can be kept a secret for over 25 years without a single person cracking? Question 6. Why has there not been any kind of insider knowledge that's come out against John Howard? You have to consider that this would be the news story of the century, and independent companies would have nothing to lose if they had serious evidence. And question 7. Why do you know so little about this event? Port Arthur Tasmania Exposed and Port Arthur The Truth is full of people who are incredibly wrong about the basics of this entire conspiracy. If you know so little about the event, how can you justify saying ridiculous stuff? How can you claim to have done deep research and then get the bare basics wrong? Why do you not possess at least that basic level of self-awareness?
And finally, question 8. Why has Blondie never come forward proclaiming his innocence? There are plenty of people who have tried to get in contact with him through the media. Why won't he grant them interviews if he's truly innocent? The prison might be able to control who he sees, but they haven't been able to control who he talks to in prison. Why have no prisoners come forward saying that he's innocent? Why does he constantly brag about his crimes to prisoners?
The answer to all of these questions is that you do not really care about what happened. I know that sounds ridiculous, but when you discover that the event was actually as mundane as it was, you have to give up this dramatic conclusion. This cycle of validation stops and the infinite loop closes. We have been told, time and time again, candidly and openly, what happened at Port Arthur. There is nothing to speculate about. You care only about the broad strokes, because there is nothing else to dig into. The event was as banal as it was shocking, but you require drama, deceit, and intrigue to maintain your worldview. Your feelings presuppose your beliefs. That's simply not a good enough reason to be a conspiracy theorist. I have spent up to 75,000 words at this point, discussing this movement in minute detail, and I am well and truly aware that, at the end of the day, I am not going to convince anyone to leave Port Arthur Truth. I do not believe that is an exaggeration. I believe that some of the less extreme truthers who vaguely know about the massacre, and, like the morgue truck and hip headshots, might be more likely to leave. People believe in these things without ever really interrogating why they believe it. They rarely assess the evidence for themselves. They just listen to other people's interpretations of the evidence. And sometimes that's good enough. It's human, it's normal. But the more extreme members of Port Arthur Truth will not move an inch. I would just be labelled as a member of the homosexual Gestapo and a Zionist and any other insult they can throw at me. Remember, they put you in a box and they say no one in that box is worth listening to. When they listen to this evidence, they need to disregard it immediately because it crumbles under pressure. And this is just denial. And denial is a human emotion. And I want to push further because I want to explore where this mindset leads to, right? And I think it leads to misery, based off of flat, uninteresting, unconvincing, and lazy evidence. I know I went into this saying that I'm probably going to get frustrated at people who get on one point that might be wrong. But it does frustrate me to no end that within this entire conspiracy theory, there is just no logic to be found. There is nothing to take seriously, and it disturbs me that a claim as significant as that can be justified by so many terrible arguments. And this is the very point. This conspiracy theory is quantity over quality. We're dealing with a set of flexible beliefs. They need to keep repeating these arguments because otherwise, any other words could inhibit those beliefs. It is the ritual here that justifies their belief. To be a Port Arthur truther is not to be a skeptic, but to be a perpetually angry and afraid human being. To live in an alternate reality where the world is much scarier and more dangerous to you specifically than it actually is. The belief in Port Arthur truth is a symptom of a much larger worldview, a kind of epistemic critique of modern Australian democracy. Pats resent democracy. They resent that they have been left behind ideologically. They pick at this wound that is Port Arthur, continuously upsetting themselves and others for entertainment and validation. They reject societal norms, not because they have an interesting critique of society, but because they feel strong emotions, and they use this tragedy to convince themselves that they are right and everyone else is wrong. There is a dark irony here. Port Arthur is still so raw in Australia as a nation because it never happened again. Think about it. In America, they have these terrible shootings every other day, and it is so traumatic that they become numb to gun violence over there. Individual events are still raw in their respective communities, Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland. These particular events are burned into the collective consciousness. But the average person does not feel as strongly about them as the average Australian feels about Port Arthur. I don't necessarily think that if the NFA was not passed, that Port Arthur truth would not exist. We haven't become numb to Port Arthur, we have healed. And Pats keep picking at that wound because their worldview depends upon events like this not only being possible, but common. Ask a conspiracy theorist what actual false flag happened in the past. They can't say anything about some random plan by the CIA in the 60s. You know, these events are supposed to be common enough that no shooting has ever been found out to be a false flag after all. You claim to be coming from a place of logic and common sense, but you craft ridiculous arguments that, under the lightest examination, crumble like tissue paper. You claim to be seekers of truth while ignoring the truth. You don't care about what happened at Port Arthur in the way that you say you do. Your actions speak louder than your words. This constant moaning is only for your movement's own enjoyment. It is the depth of human despair. And you do this for a man, a pathetic man, who could not work on improving himself so that he might craft genuine connections. So he decided to kill 35 people in an afternoon. All of this misery and all of this false effort for Blondie.
The most pathetic and cowardly criminal to arrive at Port Arthur entered the site on Sunday, 28 April 1996.
And I'm done with Port Arthur truth. As I think you should be. But this leaves us with a vacuum now, doesn't it? You know, essayists and novelists, they always end their books about conspiracy theories by saying that they represent some kind of epistemic critique of reality. It's a view of how people know things. But what the hell does that even mean? How does someone fall down a rabbit hole and then become a more afraid person? What does their worldview mean? And how can we even begin to help them get back on their feet? Well, you'll have to find out on the next episode of Acne and Coleslaw, where we will wrestle with these incredibly tough questions. You'll have to find out in Port Arthur's wake.
In Port Arthur, Dean Alan Craig, 7 Nightly News.
And the mother of the alleged gunman has tonight issued a statement through her solicitors. Carleen Bryant has been in hiding since Sunday's shootings. She wrote to the ABC in Hobart, expressing deep felt sympathy for the 35 victims and their families. She says the incident has been very traumatic for her. She now wants to be left alone.